The sun had barely crested the eastern ridge when Mason Hayes found the body. It was the spring of 1886, and the Arizona morning carried the scent of sage and juniper. Mason had risen before dawn, shouldered his Winchester, and set out to check his traps along the eastern boundary of his property. The land here rolled in gentle waves of golden grass, dotted with the occasional scrub oak and prickly pear. His boots made little sound on the earth hardened by months without significant rain. He was following a deer trail that ran alongside Sacred Water Creek when he saw it. A dark shape sprawled on the rocks at the water's edge, unnaturally still against the rippling current. At first, Mason thought it might be a fallen branch, or perhaps a deer carcass left by mountain lions. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved into the unmistakable form of a man. Mason's hand instinctively tightened on his rifle as he approached. The body lay face down, one arm stretched toward the water, as if reaching for a final drink. The man wore dusty trail clothes, a faded blue shirt now stained dark with blood. Mason crouched beside the body, his eyes quickly assessing the scene with the practiced efficiency of a former scout. The man had been shot in the back, the wound centered between the shoulder blades. No sign of a struggle, likely ambushed from behind. With careful movements, Mason rolled the body over. The man's face was weathered, perhaps in his 40s, with several days' growth of beard. His eyes stared sightlessly at the brightening sky. Mason searched the pockets, finding a few dollars, a pocket watch, and a small leather pouch. Inside the pouch was a badge, a federal marshal's star, and a folded piece of paper with Blackwood Mining and Rail written across the top. But what caught Mason's attention was the military identification tag hanging from a chain around the dead man's neck. A veteran like himself, Mason sat back on his heels, eyes scanning the surrounding terrain. The creek marked the boundary between his land and the Apache reservation. Finding a dead federal marshal here of all places meant trouble of the worst kind. He replaced the items in the man's pockets, stood up and whistled for his horse. The bay gelding approached cautiously, nostrils flaring at the scent of death. Mason mounted and turned toward town, his mind already calculating the implications. As the former chief of scouts for the 6th Cavalry, he knew how quickly a single death could spiral into chaos in these still contested lands. Copper Creek was a small mining town nestled in a valley 20 miles west of Mason's ranch. By the time he rode in, the sun was high overhead, casting sharp shadows across the dusty main street. A few locals nodded in his direction, some with genuine greeting, others with thinly veiled suspicion. Even after 6 years, many still viewed him as an outsider. The quiet rancher with a military past who kept to himself. The sheriff's office stood at the far end of the street, a simple adobe building with a wooden sign and hitching post out front. Mason dismounted, tied his horse, and pushed through the door. Sheriff Edgar Redmond sat behind his desk, a cup of coffee cooling at his elbow as he worked through a stack of wanted posters. He was an older man, silver-haired, and deeply lined with the watchful eyes of someone who had seen his share of violence. A veteran of the Civil War, Redmond had the reputation of being tough but fair, a quality Mason respected. "Hayes," Redmond said by way of greeting, setting down his pen. "Unusual to see you in town on a Tuesday." "Found a body by Sacred Water Creek this morning," Mason said without preamble. "Federal marshal shot in the back." Redmond's weathered face grew still. "You sure about that?" He had the badge. Identification tag, too. Military man. The sheriff pushed himself to his feet, reaching for his hat. "Show me." They rode back to the creek in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. When they reached the site, Mason led Redmond to the body, which lay exactly as he had left it. The sheriff knelt beside the dead man, examining the wound and searching through the pockets as Mason had done earlier. "I know him," Redmond said finally, holding the badge in his palm. "James Harding. He was investigating something around these parts. Didn't say what exactly, but he'd been asking questions about land rights and mining claims." Mason watched as a raven circled overhead, its dark shape stark against the blue sky. "He's on the boundary line. Apache land starts just across the creek." Redmond nodded, his expression grim. Bad timing for a white lawman to turn up dead so close to the reservation. The treaty's barely holding as it is. "You think the Apache had something to do with this?" Mason asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Doesn't matter what I think," Redmond replied, standing up and dusting off his knees. "Matters what folks will say. There are those in town just looking for an excuse." He gave Mason a shrewd look. "You were with the 6th, weren't you, under Colonel Blackwood?" Mason felt a familiar tightness in his chest at the name. "For a time." "Well, you know how it is then. Peace is a thin blanket out here, especially with the railroads pushing through and new mines opening up every month." Redmond gestured to the dead marshal. "And now this. I'll need to telegraph Tucson, get some men out here." "There's something else," Mason said, withdrawing the folded paper he'd found. This was in his pocket, Blackwood Mining and Rail. Redmond examined the paper, which appeared to be the beginning of a letter or report. "Harrison Blackwood, The colonel's gone private since the war's ended, building quite an empire for himself. He folded the paper and tucked it into his vest pocket. I'd steer clear of this business if I were you, Hayes. You've built a quiet life here. Best keep it that way. Mason nodded, but his mind was already turning over the connections. Harrison Blackwood had been his commanding officer during some of the bloodiest campaigns against the Apache, a hard man with little mercy and great ambition. That he was now involved in mining and railroad operations in the same territory was unlikely to be coincidence. I'll help you get him back to town, Mason offered, moving toward the body. Together they wrapped the marshal in a saddle blanket and secured him across Redmond's spare horse. As they prepared to leave, Mason noticed something glinting in the mud near where the body had lain. He picked it up, a single brass button with an eagle insignia, military issue, but not from any uniform the marshal had been wearing. Mason pocketed the button without comment, his unease growing. The dead man, the location, Blackwood's name on the document. It felt like the past reaching out with cold fingers to draw him back into conflicts he tried to leave behind. You all right, Hayes? Redmond asked, noticing his distraction. Fine, Mason replied, mounting his horse. Just thinking we might be in for a hard season. The ride back to town was as silent as their outward journey, but now laden with the weight of their grim cargo. As they approached Copper Creek, Mason could feel eyes upon them, watching from windows and doorways. News traveled fast in small towns, especially bad news. Redmond seemed to read his thoughts. I'd prepare yourself if I were you. Things are likely to get uncomfortable around here for a while, especially for a man with your history. Mason nodded but said nothing. His history. 6 years since Victorio's campaign, where he'd been wounded not just in body but in soul. 6 years trying to outrun the rumors and half-truths about what had happened in that bloody canyon where so many Apache, warriors and civilians alike, had died. 6 years of quiet labor on his small ranch, hoping to build something clean and honest with his hands. Now a dead marshal on his boundary line threatened to unravel it all. I'll keep to my land, Mason said finally as they reached the edge of town. Redmond gave him a skeptical look. Trouble has a way of finding men like you, Hayes, no matter how far you run. They parted at the undertaker's, where they delivered the body with brief explanations. Mason didn't linger in town. He bought supplies at the general store, ignoring the whispers that followed him, and rode home as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the land. That night, alone in his cabin, Mason sat by the fire and turned the brass button over in his fingers, watching the light play across its surface. Outside, the wind whispered through the juniper trees, carrying the scent of distant rain. He thought of Marshal Harding lying dead on the boundary of two worlds, and of Blackwood, whose shadow seemed to stretch across the years. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of gunfire and smoke, of voices crying out in languages he only half understood. And beneath it all, the steady rush of water over stone, like time itself flowing past, carrying away blood, but never memories. A week passed with no further news about Marshal Harding's death. Mason kept to his ranch, repairing fences, tending his small herd of cattle, and trying to ignore the growing tension he felt each time he rode near the boundary creek. Twice he spotted Apache riders in the distance, watching him from the ridgeline before disappearing like shadows into the juniper forest. On the 7th day, Mason decided to check the fence line that ran alongside Sacred Water Creek. Recent rains had raised the water level, and he worried about erosion undermining his posts. The afternoon sun beat down with unusual intensity for early spring, and by the time he reached the creek, sweat dampened his shirt, and his thoughts had turned to cooling off in the clear water. He dismounted near a bend in the creek where a stand of cottonwoods offered shade. The water here pooled deeper, slowing its pace before continuing downstream over a series of gentle rapids. Mason removed his hat, splashed water on his face, and let his horse drink. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the gentle gurgle of the creek and the occasional call of a mockingbird. It was then that he heard it, a soft splash that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the flowing water. Mason went still, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. Another splash followed, then the sound of movement through water. Silently, Mason moved through the cottonwoods, following the sound. At the next bend in the creek, sheltered by a curtain of willow branches, he saw her. A woman stood waist-deep in the creek, her back to him. Her hair, black as midnight, fell in a wet rope down her back. She wore only a simple cotton slip, now transparent, where it clung to her copper skin. She moved with deliberate grace, washing her arms and shoulders in the golden afternoon light. Mason knew he should turn away. This was a private moment he had no right to witness, yet something held him motionless. Not just the woman's beauty, but something in the dignified way she carried herself, as if performing a ritual rather than merely bathing. On the bank lay a neatly folded dress of dark blue calico, topped with a beaded belt and moccasins. Apache clothing. The realization broke Mason's trance. He began to back away, but his boot dislodged a stone that clattered down the bank. The woman turned sharply, water droplets flying from her hair like scattered diamonds. Her eyes found him immediately. Dark, intelligent eyes that showed no fear, only a keen assessment. Her features were striking: high cheekbones, a straight nose, full lips now pressed into a firm line. She didn't shriek or cover herself, but simply stood taller, shoulders squared, chin lifted in silent dignity. "I'm sorry," Mason said, voice rough with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to. You've seen me without my clothes." She interrupted, her English clear, despite the soft accent that rounded her consonants. "According to the laws of my people, you must marry me now, or we will both be punished." The words hung in the air between them, as startling as a gunshot. Mason stared, unable to formulate a response. The woman moved toward the bank with deliberate steps, water streaming from her body. Still, she did not rush or show shame. When she reached the shallows, she spoke again. "My people have eyes everywhere, white man. They will know what has happened here today." She reached for her dress, holding his gaze. "There will be talk in your town too. Trouble for you, trouble for me. The only way to stop it is for us to be bound before the story spread." Mason found his voice at last. "Miss, I truly didn't intend any disrespect. I was checking my fence line and heard a noise. Intentions matter little once a thing is done." She pulled the dress over her head in one fluid motion, the wet fabric of her slip showing briefly before the heavier calico settled into place. "I am Neil." "Mason Hayes," he replied automatically, then immediately regretted giving his name. She nodded as if confirming something already known. "The scout who rides alone." A chill ran down Mason's spine despite the warm day. Something in the way she said it suggested more knowledge than a chance encounter should allow. "You know of me, Neil finished, tying the sash at her waist before answering. "Stories travel between our peoples, even when we do not wish them to." She reached for her beaded belt, wrapping it twice around her narrow waist. "You should go now. Think on what I have said, but do not think long. Some decisions cannot wait for the moon to change." Mason remained rooted to the spot, confusion warring with an inexplicable sense of recognition. There was something familiar about her, though he was certain they had never met. "I don't understand. You can't seriously expect—" "What I expect doesn't matter," she cut him off, slipping her feet into moccasins. "What will happen if you do nothing? That is what should concern you." She walked past him up the gentle slope of the bank, close enough that he caught the scent of creek water mingled with sage. At the crest, she paused and looked back, her expression softening slightly. It wasn't kindness he saw there, but something more complex, a weight of knowledge and perhaps a touch of regret. "The wind carries words faster than horses, Mason Hayes. Remember that." Then she was gone, disappearing into the trees with barely a sound. Mason stood for a long moment, water dripping from his hands, the ghost of her presence still hanging in the air. Only when his horse nickered softly did he shake himself from his trance and return to the animal. He mounted and rode slowly, taking a roundabout path to avoid the main trail. The encounter had left him unsettled in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Neil's words echoed in his mind, along with the strange sense that she had been waiting for him, or someone like him. As the shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Mason kept seeing her face, the proud set of her shoulders, the unflinching directness of her gaze. He thought of her name, Neil. The word stirred something in his memory from his days as a scout working with Apache trackers. It meant wind in their language. By the time he reached his cabin, night had fully fallen. He cared for his horse, then built up the fire and sat before it with a cup of coffee laced with whiskey. Outside, the wind had picked up, sighing through the eaves of the small house like a woman's whisper. Mason closed his eyes, and unbidden the image of another Apache woman came to him. Her face contorted in fear as she clutched a small child to her breast, flames rising behind her. He snapped his eyes open, banishing the memory with an effort of will. That was 6 years ago during Victorio's campaign. Another life, another man. Yet as he stared into the dancing flames, he couldn't shake the feeling that the past was circling back like a predator, scenting weakness. First the dead marshal with Blackwood's name in his pocket, and now this strange encounter with an Apache woman who seemed to know more about him than she should. Mason's hand went to the scar on his left side, a puckered furrow where a bullet had torn through flesh and cracked a rib. A souvenir from that bloody day in the canyon. Some nights it still ached, as if carrying the memory of pain in its twisted tissue. Tonight would be one of those nights he knew. Sleep, when it finally came, would be thin and troubled by dreams. Dawn found Mason already awake, having given up on sleep after hours of restless turning. He dreamed of Nayol standing in the creek, but as he approached, her face transformed into that of the Apache woman from the canyon, blood streaming down her cheek as she screamed words he couldn't understand. He built up the fire and put coffee on to boil, moving with the mechanical precision of a man accustomed to his own company. Outside the eastern sky was lightning bands of pink and gold pushing back the night. A new day bringing with it decisions that couldn't be avoided. As the coffee percolated, Mason's mind returned to the canyon, to the day that had changed everything. The 6th Cavalry had been pursuing Victorio's band for weeks, following the Apache leaders' bloody raids across New Mexico and Arizona. Intelligence suggested the group had split, with women and children sheltering in a hidden canyon while the warriors continued south. Colonel Blackwood had ordered Mason and his scouts to find the canyon. What happened after that had been the subject of rumors, court inquiries, and Mason's own nightmares for years. The official report stated that the cavalry had engaged hostile forces after being fired upon. 28 Apache had been killed, including 15 women and children. 7 soldiers had died, with 15 more wounded, including Scout Sergeant Mason Hayes. What the report didn't mention was Blackwood's order to leave no survivors. It didn't mention how Mason had objected, arguing that non-combatants should be taken to the reservation. It didn't mention how Blackwood had drawn his sidearm and threatened to shoot Mason for insubordination. It didn't mention the young Apache scout who had been with them, who translated Mason's heated argument with Blackwood and then slipped away to warn his people. By the time Mason reached the canyon, the attack had already begun. He found chaos. Soldiers firing into teepees, women running with children in their arms, warriors fighting desperately with whatever weapons they had. Mason had tried to intervene to stop the slaughter, but in the confusion, someone had shot him from behind. As he lay bleeding on the rocky ground, he watched an Apache woman running with a child in her arms. A soldier took aim at them. Mason had managed to draw his pistol and shoot the soldier in the leg. The woman had looked back at him for just a moment, a look of surprise and desperate gratitude, before disappearing into the smoke. Later, as he drifted in and out of consciousness during the long journey back to Fort Bowie, Mason heard Blackwood giving his version of events. How Mason had been shot by an Apache, how the engagement had been necessary and justified, how Mason was to be commended for his bravery, but relieved of duty due to his injuries. No one questioned the colonel's account. No one except a young lieutenant who had witnessed part of the confrontation before the attack. He tried to speak up for Mason, but was quickly silenced. 2 weeks later, the lieutenant was found dead. A hunting accident. The message was clear. Mason took his discharge papers and his silence and disappeared into the vastness of the territory, eventually settling on the small ranch where he now lived. He thought the past was buried, if not forgotten. But now, with Blackwood's name surfacing and this strange encounter with Neol, he felt old wounds reopening. The coffee boiled over, hissing as it hit the hot coals. Mason cursed and moved the pot, burning his fingers in the process. He sucked on his scorched knuckles and poured a cup of the bitter brew, wondering if he should ride into town for supplies and to see if there was any news about the marshal's death. In the end, the decision was made for him. His flour was running low and he needed ammunition. Copper Creek was the nearest place to get both. He saddled his horse under a sky now fully bright with morning sun. The air was cool but promised warmth later, a perfect spring day in the high desert. As he rode, Mason kept his eyes on the terrain, alert for any sign of watchers. The boundary between his land and the Apache reservation seemed to vibrate with new significance after yesterday's encounter. Copper Creek was already bustling when Mason arrived. Wagons lined the main street, and the sound of hammering came from the new hotel being built at the north end. The discovery of a rich silver vein last year had brought an influx of miners and the businesses that catered to them. The once sleepy settlement was growing rapidly, pushing ever closer to the reservation lands. Mason tied his horse outside the general store and went inside. The shop smelled of coffee leather and dried herbs hanging in bunches from the rafters. Behind the counter stood Widow Abigail Thornton, a stern-faced woman in her 50s who had taken over the store after her husband was killed in an Apache raid years earlier. She had little love for the native people and made no secret of it. "Mr. Hayes," she acknowledged with a nod. "Been a while." "Mrs. Thornton," he replied, setting his list on the counter. "Need a few things." She glanced at the list and began gathering items. "Heard about the marshal," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Found near your place, wasn't he?" Mason nodded, keeping his expression equally neutral. "On the Boundary Creek. Sheriff Redmond and I brought him in." She measured coffee beans into a paper sack. "Talk is it was Apache work. Shot in the back, they're saying. People say a lot of things." Mrs. Thornton's eyes narrowed slightly. "That they do. They're also saying there's been Apache crossing onto settled lands more often lately. Young men with painted faces watching the town." Mason said nothing, waiting as she added flour and salt to his order. "And now there's talk about one of their women being seen with a white man near the creek." She gave him a pointed look. Wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Mr. Hayes? The question hung in the air like gunsmoke. Mason met her gaze steadily. I mind my own business, Mrs. Thornton. Suggest others might do the same. A flush rose in the widow's cheeks. Well, some business affects us all, especially with Blackwood's railroad survey crews moving in. They're saying the line will go right through the northern edge of the reservation. Progress, they call it. She sniffed. About time, if you ask me. Too much good land wasted on people who won't use it properly. Mason paid for his supplies, fighting to keep his expression neutral. Been meaning to ask, any word on who's buying up water rights along the creek? Noticed some survey stakes on my last ride. Mrs. Thornton's expression shifted subtly. Blackwood's company, I expect. They've been acquiring all sorts of rights, offering good money too. You thinking of selling? No, Mason said firmly, just curious. As he gathered his purchases, the store's door opened, admitting Sheriff Redmond, along with two well-dressed men Mason didn't recognize. One wore a city suit with a gold watch chain, the other the uniform of a cavalry officer, a captain by his insignia. Hayes, Redmond nodded. Good timing. These gentlemen were asking about you. Mason felt a familiar tightening in his gut. Oh, Captain James Ellis, 4th Cavalry. The officer introduced himself with a crisp nod. And this is Mr. Lawrence Reed, legal representative for Blackwood Mining and Rail. The lawyer stepped forward, extending a manicured hand. Mr. Hayes, a pleasure. I understand you were once chief of scouts under Colonel Blackwood. Mason ignored the outstretched hand. That was a long time ago. Reed withdrew his hand smoothly, as if the rebuff meant nothing. Nevertheless, your experience could be valuable. The colonel, Mr. Blackwood now, of course, remembers your service fondly. He's established quite a significant operation in the territory and is always looking for men with local knowledge. I'm a rancher now, Mason said flatly, not looking for other work. Captain Ellis spoke up, his tone carrying the practiced authority of command. We're investigating Marshal Harding's death. Hayes, I understand you discovered the body. That's right. On Apache land. Mason's eyes narrowed. No, on the boundary. My side of the creek. Ellis exchanged a glance with Reed. Nevertheless, quite close to the reservation. Marshal Harding was investigating land fraud and treaty violations. He'd reported concerns about unauthorized Apache movement off the reservation. Is that so? Mason kept his voice even. Strange. The Apache I've seen tend to stay on their side of the line. It's the survey crews and prospectors who seem confused about boundaries. Reed's smile tightened. Progress requires flexibility, Mr. Hayes. The railroad will bring prosperity to everyone in the territory, even the Apache eventually. But there are elements opposed to development. Troublemakers. Marshal Harding may have fallen victim to such elements. The implication hung in the air. Mason looked to Redmond, whose weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts. If you gentlemen are finished with your shopping, Redmond said finally, perhaps we could continue this conversation at my office. Mason gathered his supplies. I've got a long ride back. Another time then, Reed said smoothly. Colonel Blackwood will be most interested to know we've located you. He may call on you himself when he arrives next week. Mason felt cold despite the warm store. I'll be at my ranch, he said, moving past them toward the door, though I doubt the colonel and I have much to discuss after all these years. Outside, Mason secured his supplies to his saddle, his mind racing. Blackwood coming here personally, a dead marshal investigating land fraud, and now these men asking questions. None of it boded well. Add to that his encounter with Niall and the rumors already spreading through town, and Mason felt a familiar pressure building, the tension that preceded violence. As he mounted his horse, a small figure darted from between two buildings. An Apache boy of perhaps 12 or 13 dressed in a mixture of traditional clothing and cast-off white man's garments. Before Mason could react, the boy thrust a small package toward him, then disappeared down an alley. Mason looked around quickly, but no one seemed to have noticed the exchange. He tucked the package inside his coat and rode out of town, resisting the urge to spur his horse to a gallop. Only when he was well away from Copper Creek did he stop in the shelter of a rocky outcropping to examine what the boy had given him. The package was wrapped in a scrap of soft deerskin tied with sinew. Inside was a silver pendant on a leather cord, a circular medallion with a sunburst design. Mason stared at it, recognition dawning slowly. It was a medal he had carried throughout his scouting days, a gift from his father that he had always considered a good luck charm. Until the day in the canyon when he had pressed it into the small hand of a child, the child the Apache woman had been carrying when he helped them escape. With the pendant was a folded piece of paper. Written in a careful hand were the words, "Niall knows who you are." Mason sat very still, feeling the weight of the pendant in his palm. It was impossible. The woman and child had disappeared into the chaos of the attack. He had never known if they survived, had never expected to encounter them again. Yet here was his medallion returned after 6 years, along with a message that sent a chill through his blood. Neil knew who he was, not just Mason Hayes the rancher, but the scout who had been present at the Canyon massacre. The man who had failed to prevent a slaughter, but had managed perhaps to save 2 lives in the midst of it. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the scent of sage across the empty land. Mason closed his hand around the medallion, feeling its familiar contours press into his palm. The past, it seemed, was not content to remain buried. It had found him wearing the face of a proud woman standing in a creek, offering both threat and promise in the same breath. He tucked the medallion into his shirt pocket close to his heart and rode toward home with a new wariness. The world had shifted beneath him, revealing hidden currents and old dangers. Whatever game was being played, by Blackwood, by the Apache, by fate itself, Mason now found himself squarely in the middle of it. And somewhere across the boundary waters, Neil was waiting for his response. That night, Mason dreamed of the canyon again. But this time, as the Apache woman fled with her child, she turned back to look at him, and her face was Niall's. She called to him in words he couldn't understand, gesturing urgently toward the mountains. When he tried to follow, his legs wouldn't move, and he could only watch as she disappeared into smoke and gunfire. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. The medallion lay on the table beside his bed, where he had placed it, catching the faint moonlight that filtered through the window. Mason reached for it, running his thumb over the sunburst pattern worn smooth by years of handling. A decision was forming in his mind, though he wasn't yet ready to acknowledge it fully. After a simple breakfast, he gathered supplies: a small pouch of coffee beans, a package of tobacco, a folding knife with a bone handle that had served him well for years. He wrapped these items in a clean cloth, securing the bundle with twine. As the sun crested the eastern ridges, Mason rode towards Sacred Water Creek. The morning was crisp, with threads of mist rising from the land like departing spirits. He scanned the terrain continuously, alert for any sign of watchers, but saw only a hawk circling high overhead. At the creek, Mason dismounted near the large juniper tree that marked the boundary of his property. Its gnarled trunk and spreading branches had weathered countless seasons, roots gripping the rocky soil with tenacious strength. He placed his bundle of gifts in a hollow at the base of the tree, where it would be protected from the elements but visible to anyone who knew to look. He didn't expect an immediate response. This was the opening move in a conversation that might take days or even weeks to unfold. Among the Apache, patience was valued and time measured differently than in the white man's world. Mason lingered only long enough to water his horse, then rode back to his ranch. There was work to be done: fence posts to replace cattle, to check a loose board on the porch to nail down. Physical labor had been his salvation these past years, exhausting his body so thoroughly that sometimes even the dreams couldn't find him. The day passed in the rhythm of these tasks, the sun arcing overhead and beginning its descent toward the western mountains. As evening approached, Mason found himself drawn back toward the creek, a pull he didn't try to resist. The juniper tree stood sentinel in the golden light of late afternoon. Mason approached cautiously, alert for any movement. When he reached the tree, he discovered his bundle was gone, and in its place lay something new: a small deerskin pouch elaborately beaded in geometric patterns of red and black. Inside was a handful of dried herbs that released a pungent, earthy scent when Mason crushed a leaf between his fingers. He recognized some of the plants: sage, cedar, something that might be desert willow, but others were unfamiliar. A medicine bundle, perhaps, or ingredients for a tea. Beside the pouch lay a slender bracelet woven from red threads, with a single blue bead worked into the pattern. Simple, yet made with evident care. Mason held these offerings in his palm, understanding their significance. A response, an acknowledgement, a continuation of whatever had begun at their meeting by the creek. He sat with his back against the juniper tree, watching the light change as the sun sank lower. The creek murmured, its endless songwater flowing over stone in a rhythm unchanged for centuries. Here on this boundary between worlds, Mason felt a rare moment of peace settle over him. The canyon and its horrors seemed distant, as did the complications waiting in town. There was only this moment: the solid trunk at his back, the scent of sage and juniper in the air, the cool breeze ruffling his hair, and the small tokens of communication in his hand. He thought of Neil, imagined her fingers working the beads onto the deerskin, weaving the red threads of the bracelet. What was she thinking as she created these gifts? Was it obligation that drove her, or something else? Did she truly know who he was, what role he had played in that bloody day 6 years ago? The sun touched the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of copper and gold. Mason slipped the red bracelet onto his wrist, tucked the medicine pouch into his shirt, and rose to his feet. Tomorrow he would bring something else. Perhaps the book of poetry he'd carried throughout his scouting days, its pages dog-eared and stained, but the words still a comfort in the wilderness. As he mounted his horse for the ride home, Mason caught a flicker of movement on the ridge across the creek. A figure on horseback silhouetted against the sunset. Though too distant to identify, Mason knew with certainty it was Neol watching him from Apache land. He raised his hand in acknowledgement, and after a moment the figure returned the gesture before melting into the gathering dusk. The exchange of gifts continued over the next week. Mason left the book of poetry wrapped carefully to protect it from the elements. The next day, it was gone, replaced by a small carved arrowhead of polished stone, its edges smoothed to a dull gleam. He left tobacco and dried beef. She left a woven grass mat and more herbs. Each day something new. Each day a message without words. Sometimes Mason caught glimpses of her at a distance, a figure moving through trees, a shadow on the ridgeline. But they did not speak or meet directly. This dance at the boundaries had its own rules, its own timing. Mason found himself thinking of her throughout his days, wondering about her life across the creek, her thoughts, her story. The red bracelet remained on his wrist, a constant reminder of this strange connection. Occasionally he caught himself rubbing the single blue bead with his thumb, as he once had done with the silver medallion. On the 8th day, dark clouds gathered over the mountains to the west, promising the first real storm of the spring. Mason rode to the juniper tree earlier than usual, not wanting his gift, a small mirror in a wooden frame, to be damaged by rain. The air felt heavy with moisture, and distant thunder rolled across the sky. He had just placed the mirror in the hollow when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, the gentle shower became a downpour. Mason mounted his horse and urged it toward a nearby outcropping of rock where they might find shelter. The rocks formed a shallow cave just deep enough to provide protection from the worst of the rain. Mason dismounted and led his horse inside, water streaming from his hat brim and down the back of his neck. He removed his wet coat and hat, hanging them on a projecting rock to dry. "You choose a poor day for your visit." The voice from the shadows made Mason whirl his hand, dropping instinctively to his holster. Neol stepped forward, her form materializing from the deeper darkness at the back of the shelter. She wore a dress of dark blue calico, a woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the sudden chill. Her hair was braided and wound at the nape of her neck, a few loose strands framing her face. "You startled me," Mason said, relaxing his posture, but keeping his hand near his gun. "I have been here since morning," she replied, gesturing to a small bundle of her own belongings in the corner. The sky told of rain coming. Outside, the storm intensified, sheets of water cascading from the rock overhang like a silver curtain. Thunder cracked overhead, followed by lightning that briefly illuminated the small space with harsh white light. They stood regarding each other in silence for a long moment, the sound of rain filling the air between them. Mason noticed she wore a necklace, a leather cord from which hung his silver medallion. "You kept it," he said softly. "All these years." Neol's hand went to the medallion. "Not me. My sister's child kept it, until the fever took her." The words landed like stones in Mason's chest. "She died. A year after the canyon." Niall's dark eyes held his unflinching. "She spoke of the soldier with kind eyes who helped them escape. She showed this medallion to the elders as proof not all white men brought death." Mason closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the news. The child he had helped save had died anyway. Yet somehow his medallion had found its way to Neol, creating this connection across years and blood. "Your sister," he said. "Did she survive too?" Neol shook her head, her expression carefully controlled. "She was wounded during the escape. The bullet took her 3 days later." "I'm sorry," Mason whispered, the inadequacy of the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "Before she died, she made me promise to find the kind-eyed soldier." Neol's voice remained steady, but Mason could sense the deep currents of emotion beneath her composure. "She believed the Great Spirit had sent you to save her child, even if only for a short time." "I didn't save anyone," Mason said, the old guilt rising in his throat. "I tried to stop it. I failed. Yet my niece lived when others died. Long enough to learn songs and stories. Long enough to laugh and run in the sunshine." Neol stepped closer, close enough that Mason could see the individual raindrops glistening in her hair. "That is not nothing, Mason Hayes." The sound of his name on her lips sent an unexpected warmth through him. In the confined space of the rock shelter, with rain drumming on the world outside, they might have been the only two people left alive. "How did you find me?" he asked. "The wind carries words, stories of a former scout who settled alone near our lands. A quiet man who treats the Apache with respect, who minds the boundaries." She shrugged slightly. "I listened, I watched. When I saw you by the creek that day, I knew." "And the marriage demand, was that just to get my attention?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. It is truly our law. But yes, I needed to speak with you. There are dangers coming that concern us both. Blackwood, Mason said, not a question. Neil nodded. His men push at our borders. They seek the silver beneath our sacred grounds. They offer treaties with one hand while making threats with the other. Her expression hardened. My father is ill. The tribal council is divided. Some wish to fight others to surrender more land for peace. And what do you want, Justice? She said simply. Truth. The canyon was not the first massacre, nor the last, but it was the one you witnessed, the one that broke something in you. She reached out her fingers, brushing lightly against his chest above his heart. I see it in your eyes, the same wound my people carry. Mason caught her hand, holding it for a moment before releasing it. The brief contact left his skin tingling. I'm just one man, Neil. What do you expect me to do against Blackwood and his company? Stand with us. Speak the truth about what happened in the canyon. Your words would carry weight with your people. Mason laughed bitterly. My word against a decorated colonel turned wealthy businessmen, against progress and profit, no one would listen. The dead marshal would have listened. Neil's gaze was intent. He was gathering evidence against Blackwood. Land fraud, bribery, treaty violations. Mason's eyes narrowed. How do you know this? He spoke with our council 2 weeks before his death. He promised to help protect our boundaries. Neil's voice lowered. 3 days later, he was found dead on the border of our lands. Convenient for those who wish to blame Apache raiders. The implications settled heavily in the small space. Mason turned to look out at the falling rain, his mind working through the connections. Blackwood killed him, or had him killed. So we believe. You need proof, I need proof. Mason ran a hand through his damp hair. Without it, it's just more rumors and accusations. The marshal had a journal. He showed it to our council, names, dates, details of Blackwood's schemes. Neil moved to stand beside him, both of them watching the silver curtain of rain. It was not found with his body. Mason glanced at her sharply. You think Blackwood has it? Or it is hidden somewhere? The marshal was clever. He would not carry such evidence openly when meeting with those he suspected. They stood in silence for a time, the storm gradually lessening, the thunder moving eastward. A complex mixture of emotions churned in Mason's chest. Old guilt, new purpose, and something else he wasn't ready to name. Something stirred by this proud woman who had sought him out across years and bloodshed. Why me, he asked finally. Why not go to the authorities, to Redmond? Redmond is one man with limited power, and how do we know whom to trust? Neil turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the gray light from the cave entrance. You were there, Mason Hayes. You tried to stop the killing when others embraced it. That makes you different. The rain had slowed to a gentle patter, sunlight breaking through the clouds to create a shimmering veil across the landscape. Mason gathered his now damp coat and hat. I need time to think, he said. Neil nodded respect in her gaze. The storm has passed, but greater ones are gathering. Choose your ground, carefully, Scout. As Mason prepared to leave, she spoke again, her voice softer. The gifts you left, they were well chosen. The book especially. Such beauty in the white man's words. Mason paused, surprised. You can read English. My mother taught me. She was a missionary's daughter before she fell in love with my father. A shadow crossed Neil's face. She died when I was young, but she left me her books and her language. Another piece of the puzzle that was Neil fell into place. A woman of two worlds, like Mason himself in many ways. Perhaps that explained the strange sense of recognition he had felt from their first meeting. I'll come again tomorrow, he said, the decision made even as he spoke the words. Neil inclined her head slightly, neither acceptance nor refusal. The juniper will stand regardless. Mason mounted his horse and rode out into the freshly washed world, the scent of wet sage rising from the earth like incense. Behind him, Niall remained in the shelter of the rocks, a presence he could feel even without looking back. The red bracelet on his wrist seemed to pulse with a warmth of its own, and the memory of her fingers against his chest lingered like a promise, or a warning. Mason was halfway back to his ranch when he spotted the riders, 3 men on horseback moving along the ridgeline that marked his eastern boundary. Even at a distance, he could tell they weren't Apache. Their posture in the saddle, the broad-brimmed hats, the way they rode abreast rather than single file, all marked them as white men. He reined in his horse, watching as they surveyed the land below. One pointed toward the creek, another toward Mason's cabin in the distance. They hadn't seen him yet, partially concealed as he was by a stand of junipers. Mason backed his horse slowly into the cover of the trees, then urged it forward along a game trail that would keep him hidden as he circled behind the riders. Years of scouting had taught him how to move through terrain undetected, reading the land like a book written in rock and shadow. He emerged on higher ground where he could observe the men more clearly. One wore the uniform of a railroad company surveyor, complete with transit case strapped to his saddle. The other two were dressed as cowhands, but carried themselves like soldiers. All three were armed, revolvers at their hips, rifles in scabbards. Blackwood's men, without a doubt. Surveying not just for the railroad Mason suspected, but assessing the entire area, his ranch included. He remained motionless until the men rode on, disappearing over the ridge toward town. Only then did he continue home, a new tension settled between his shoulder blades. The encounter with Neil followed so quickly by the appearance of these strangers on his land, it couldn't be coincidence. Events were accelerating, forces converging like storm clouds building on the horizon. That night, Mason cleaned his weapons with methodical care. The Winchester rifle, the Colt revolver, the knife he kept razor sharp. Old habits from his scouting days, preparing for trouble before it arrived. As his hands worked through the familiar motions, his mind turned over recent events, searching for the pattern, the way forward. Blackwood was coming, bringing with him the power of money, political connections, and whatever dark secrets lay buried in the past. The marshal who might have stood against him was dead. The Apache were divided and vulnerable, and Mason himself was caught between worlds. No longer a scout, but not fully a settler, either viewed with suspicion by both sides. Yet for the first time in years, he felt something stirring beneath the guilt and isolation that had defined his life since the canyon. Purpose, perhaps, or simply the recognition that running from the past had never truly worked. Sleep came eventually, dreamless and deep. Mason woke before dawn, his decision made. He would ride into town, speak with Redmond, try to learn more about the marshal's investigation. Knowledge was the first step toward action. Copper Creek was already bustling when he arrived, the main street crowded with wagons and riders. Mason noted several unfamiliar faces. Railroad men, mostly by their dress and equipment. The small mining town was transforming before his eyes, growth feeding on itself as news of silver, strikes, and the coming railroad drew more fortune seekers. He found Sheriff Redmond at the jailhouse poring over wanted posters with a cup of coffee at his elbow. The older man looked up as Mason entered, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Hayes, he acknowledged. Twice in 1 week. Must be a record. Mason hung his hat on a peg by the door. Need to talk to you, Sheriff, about Marshal Harding. Redmond gestured to a chair. Figured you might. Coffee? Thanks. Mason accepted the mug. Redmond poured the brew strong enough to stand a spoon in. Any news about who killed him? Official investigations ongoing, Redmond said carefully. Army's involved now, as you saw. Captain Ellis has been asking a lot of questions. About me, Redmond nodded. About you, about the Apache, about Blackwood too, though more discreetly. Mason raised an eyebrow. He suspects Blackwood. Ellis is career military, but he's no fool. He knows politics when he sees it. Redmond leaned back in his chair, studying Mason over the rim of his mug. Question is, why are you suddenly so interested? You've been keeping to yourself for years, Hayes. Now a marshal turns up dead and here you are in my office asking questions. Mason considered his words carefully. Trust came hard to him after the canyon, but he needed allies. I've been approached by someone who says Harding was investigating Blackwood for land fraud and treaty violations. Approached by whom? An Apache woman, Neil. Redmond's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. The one from the creek. Word gets around, Hayes. Folks are talking. Let them talk, Mason said more sharply than he intended. What matters is Harding was killed because of what he knew. Neil says he had a journal with evidence against Blackwood. And you believe her. I have reason to. Mason hesitated, then decided to share at least part of the truth. I encountered her people before, during Victorio's campaign. There was an incident, a massacre that wasn't reported accurately. Redmond set down his coffee. I've heard rumors, bad business in a canyon, women and children killed. It was worse than the reports said. Blackwood ordered it. I tried to stop it. Mason's voice grew tight. I was shot for my trouble. Blackwood covered it up, made it look like an Apache attack threatened anyone who might tell the truth. And you think this connects to Harding's death? I think Blackwood is capable of murder to protect his interests. I think Harding found evidence of it, possibly related to the Canyon massacre, definitely related to current land grabs. Mason leaned forward. Have you searched for a journal among Harding's effects? There wasn't much on the body, some papers, badge, personal items. Redmond frowned. No journal that I recall, but his saddlebags and horse were missing. Someone took them after killing him, Mason concluded, either to find the journal or because they already knew what was in it. Redmond studied him for a long moment. You're stepping into dangerous territory, Hayes. Blackwood has powerful friends. Governor counts him as a supporter. Army contracts. Railroad money. I know. Do you... Because from where I sit, it looks like you're considering going up against a man who could crush you without breaking stride. Redmond's gaze was penetrating. And for what justice, for a dead marshal or something more personal? Mason didn't answer immediately. The question struck too close to truths he was still reconciling within himself. Finally, he said, maybe both. Does it matter? It might, depending on how far you're willing to go. Redmond rose and moved to the window looking out at the busy street. Blackwood arrives tomorrow. Big reception planned at the new hotel. Everyone who's anyone in the territory will be there celebrating progress and prosperity. And you? I'll be there, keeping the peace. Redmond turned back to face Mason. My job's getting more complicated by the day, Hayes. Town's growing, tensions with the Apache rising, railroad bringing new problems along with new opportunities. He sighed. I'm getting too old for it, truth be told. What about the journal? Mason pressed. Will you help me look for it? Redmond considered for a moment. I'll make some inquiries, quietly. If Harding hid evidence somewhere, there might be a trail. He fixed Mason with a stern look. But you need to tread carefully, especially with this Apache woman. People are already talking and not kindly. Mason stood reaching for his hat. I can handle talk. Can you handle a lynch mob? Because that's where this could end if things go badly. Redmond's voice hardened. I've seen it before. All it takes is one incident. A dead white man, rumors of Apache involvement, a white man suspected of divided loyalties, and even reasonable people turn into animals. The warning hung in the air between them. Mason knew Redmond was right, had seen the same darkness himself during his years on the frontier. Yet he couldn't turn back now, not with Neol's trust placed in him, not with the possibility of finally confronting the truth of the Canyon Massacre. I'll be careful, he said finally, but I won't be silent. Not again. Redmond nodded slowly. Fair enough. Watch your back, Hayes. And maybe stay away from town for a few days until Blackwood's reception is over. Mason left the jailhouse, the weight of Redmond's warnings settling alongside his other burdens. The town seemed different now. Faces, less friendly eyes following him with new speculation. A group of men outside the saloon fell silent as he passed, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and hostility. Word traveled fast in small communities. Mason Hayes, the reclusive ex-scout consorting with an Apache woman. Mason Hayes asking questions about a dead marshal. Mason Hayes potentially standing in the way of progress and prosperity. He was halfway to his horse when a voice called his name. Turning, he saw Lawrence Reed Blackwood's lawyer emerging from the bank with several men in business attire. Mr. Hayes, what fortunate timing. Reed's smile was practiced, his manner smoothly confident as he approached. I was just discussing your property with these gentlemen from the Territorial Land Office. Mason tensed. My property isn't for discussion or sale. Every property has its price, Mr. Hayes, Reed countered, still smiling. Especially when progress demands it. The planned railroad spur to service the new mines will need to cross a corner of your land. Colonel Blackwood is prepared to make a very generous offer. Not interested, Mason said flatly, turning to go. Reed's voice hardened slightly. I would reconsider if I were you. The territorial government has certain rights of eminent domain for essential development. It would be unfortunate if we had to pursue that avenue. Mason turned back slowly, meeting Reed's gaze with cold intensity. Threaten me again and we'll have a different kind of conversation. The lawyer's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. No threat intended, I assure you. Merely outlining options. He extended a card. Colonel Blackwood arrives tomorrow. He's expressed a personal interest in meeting with you. Perhaps you'll join us at the reception, 7 o'clock at the Copper Creek Hotel. Mason ignored the card. Idiot. I'll be busy. As he mounted his horse, Mason felt Reed's eyes on his back, calculating and cold. The encounter left him with a sour taste in his mouth and a growing certainty that events were accelerating beyond his control. He rode out of town at a measured pace, resisting the urge to look back. Only when Copper Creek was well behind him did he turn off the main trail, taking a circuitous route through rocky terrain where tracks would be difficult to follow. The habits of a scout died hard, especially when danger loomed. By mid-afternoon, Mason reached Sacred Water Creek, drawn there by an instinct he didn't question. The juniper tree stood as it had for centuries, its gnarled trunk and spreading branches, a testament to survival against all odds. To his surprise, Neol was already there, seated at the base of the tree. She wore a simple dress of brown cotton, her hair in a single braid down her back. In her lap lay a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded. You came earlier than expected. Mason dismounted, letting his horse drink from the creek. Town was unwelcoming. Thought I'd find better company here. A hint of a smile touched her lips. And did you, I believe so. He settled beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. I spoke with Sheriff Redmond about the marshal and his journal. Niall listened intently as Mason recounted his conversation with Redmond, her dark eyes revealing nothing of her thoughts. When he mentioned the missing saddlebags, she nodded slowly. The marshal was clever. He would not keep such evidence with him if he suspected danger. Redmond will help us look for it, Mason said, discreetly. Can he be trusted? I believe so. He's no friend to Blackwood from what I can tell. Mason plucked a stem of grass, rolling it between his fingers. Blackwood arrives tomorrow. Big reception at the new hotel. We know. Our scouts have been watching the preparations. Neil's voice hardened. He brings more men with him. Gunmen dressed as railroad workers. Not surprising. Blackwood always believed in force. Mason glanced at her. His lawyer approached me in town. They want my land for a railroad spur. And you refused? Of course, Video. Neil was silent for a moment, her fingers working at the bundle in her lap. Finally, she unwrapped it, revealing several sheets of paper covered in writing. These belong to my mother, she said, handling them with reverence. Her journal. She wrote of her life among my father's people, of the beauty and hardship she found here. Neil's voice softened, and of the cruelty of her own people who cast her out for loving an Apache. She offered the pages to Mason, who took them carefully, aware of the trust implied in the gesture. The handwriting was delicate, educated, a woman's hand from another world. As he scanned the entries, a picture emerged of a young missionary's daughter who had fallen in love with an Apache man, defied her family and society to be with him, and embraced a new life while still clinging to elements of her old one, books writing her faith. She was brave, Mason said, returning the pages. Yes, and lonely sometimes, though she never admitted it to my father. Neil rewrapped the journal carefully. I am like her in some ways, between worlds belonging fully to neither. The admission hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest. Mason felt an unexpected kinship with this woman who understood what it meant to live on boundaries, to carry the weight of divided loyalties. I know something of that, he said quietly. Neil looked at him with those deep, knowing eyes. Yes, I believe you do. They sat in companionable silence as the afternoon light began to fade, the creek murmuring its endless song beside them. In this moment of quiet understanding, the complications waiting in town, the dangers represented by Blackwood, even the unresolved question of the marshal's journal, all seemed to recede, if only temporarily. It was Neil who finally broke the silence. Tomorrow, while the town celebrates Blackwood's arrival, some of our young men plan to search for the marshal's horse and saddlebags. They believe it may be hidden in the hills east of where the body was found. That's dangerous, Mason said, concern evident in his voice. If they're caught on settled land armed, they know the risk, but time grows short. Neil's expression was resolute. Blackwood will not wait long to move against our land once he arrives. Mason considered for a moment. Tell them to wait, I'll join them. I know how marshals think, where a man might hide something important if he feared for his life. Surprise flashed across Neil's face. You would do this cross onto Apache land away from the protection of your laws. Your laws aren't so different from mine when it comes to justice, Mason replied. And I've spent enough time among your people to know I'll be treated fairly if my intentions are honest. Neil studied him for a long moment, as if seeing him anew. Tomorrow night, then, when the town is distracted by Blackwood's arrival, I will send word where to meet. As she rose to leave, her hand brushed against Mason's, perhaps by accident, perhaps not. The brief contact sent warmth coursing up his arm, settling somewhere deep in his chest. Be careful in town, she said. Blackwood has many eyes. And you be careful on the boundary, he responded. Not everyone respects the lines on maps. Neil smiled, then a genuine smile that transformed her serious face. The true boundaries are not on any map, Mason Hayes. They are here. She touched her heart, and here. She touched her temple. With that, she turned and walked away, crossing the creek with practiced ease, her figure soon disappearing among the trees on the far bank. Mason remained by the juniper, watching the light fade from the sky, feeling the red bracelet on his wrist like a promise. Tomorrow would bring Blackwood with all the ghosts and dangers of the past. But it would also bring a chance to right old wrongs, to stand with the Neil and her people against injustice. For the first time in years, Mason felt the weight of the canyon lifting slightly. Not forgiveness, he wasn't sure he deserved that yet, but perhaps the beginning of redemption. As darkness fell, he rode home under a sky brilliant with stars, the same stars that had guided his scouting parties years ago, the same stars that watched over Neil and her village across the boundary waters. Some boundaries, it seemed, were not so insurmountable after all. The day of Blackwood's arrival dawned clear and bright, the spring sky a vast blue canopy stretching from horizon to horizon. Mason rose early, his sleep having been fitful and plagued by fragments of dreams. the canyon gunfire Neol's face transforming into her sister's as flames rose behind her. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to wash away the lingering images, then set about his morning chores with deliberate focus. By mid-morning, he had decided to ride into town one last time before Blackwood's reception. There were supplies he needed information to gather and a growing sense that he should see the lay of the land before committing to the night's search for the marshal's saddlebags. Copper Creek had transformed overnight. Flags and bunting decorated the main street, and a large banner stretched across the front of the new hotel proclaimed, "Welcome, Colonel Blackwood, bringing progress to the territory." Workers scurried about setting up tables and chairs for the evening's festivities, while the town's more prominent citizens stood in small groups discussing the imminent arrival with barely contained excitement. Mason tied his horse outside the general store, aware of the glances and whispers that followed him. His reputation as a recluse had always generated curiosity. Now, with rumors of his association with an Apache woman circulating, that curiosity had sharpened into something more pointed. Widow Thornton was arranging a display of canned goods when he entered the store. She looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Hayes, surprised to see you in town today." "Need supplies, Mrs. Thornton, same as always." She nodded stiffly. "Of course, though you picked quite the day for it. Town's in quite a state over the Colonel's visit." "So, I see." Mason placed his list on the counter. "Just need the basics. Flour, coffee, ammunition." As she gathered his items, Mrs. Thornton kept up a stream of commentary about Blackwood's visit, the planned reception, the prospects for the town's growth. Mason listened in with half an ear, more interested in the undertones. The way certain names were emphasized, the subtle shifts in her voice when discussing the railroad's plans. "They're saying the Apache reservation will be reduced by half," she said, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. "All that good land opened up for settlement. About time, if you ask me." Mason kept his expression neutral. "Treaty protects that land." "Treaties change." She gave him a sharp look. "Progress doesn't wait for savages to catch up, Mr. Hayes. Surely you of all people understand that, having served with the Colonel." Before Mason could respond, the store's door opened to admit Sheriff Redmond. The older man nodded to both of them, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Hayes, Mrs. Thornton, fine day." "Indeed, Sheriff," Mrs. Thornton replied, her tone warming considerably. "We were just discussing the Colonel's visit. Such an exciting time for Copper Creek." "That it is." Redmond turned to Mason. "Mind stepping outside for a word when you're finished here?" Mason nodded, completed his purchase, and followed Redmond outside. They walked a short distance from the store, stopping near the livery stable where they were less likely to be overheard. "Thought I advised you to stay away from town today," Redmond said without preamble. "Needed supplies and information." "Well, here's some information for you." Redmond's voice lowered. "Blackwood's advance men have been asking questions about you specifically. Your land, your history with the 6th Cavalry, your recent activities." A cold weight settled in Mason's stomach. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggests they already know the answers and are just looking for confirmation." Redmond's eyes held a warning. "Word is they're particularly interested in your movements around the time the marshal was killed." "They're trying to frame me," Mason said, the pieces falling into place. "Set me up as a scapegoat for Harding's murder." "It fits. You found the body. You have a history with Blackwood. You've been seen meeting with Apache." Redmond shook his head. "It's a neat solution from their perspective. Blame falls on you, suspicion falls on the Apache, and any evidence Harding gathered dies with both of you." Mason absorbed this anger building like a slow-burning fire. "Blackwood hasn't changed, still solving problems by eliminating witnesses." "There's more," Redmond continued. "I made those inquiries about Harding's effects. Turns out he'd rented a room at the boarding house for several weeks. Paid in advance but rarely slept there. His things were collected by a military aide after his death, but the landlady mentioned something interesting. Harding had asked her about safe places to store valuables. Did she tell him anything? Directed him to the bank, but according to the bank manager, Harding never opened an account or safety deposit box." Redmond frowned. "Man like that carrying sensitive information would have contingencies, places to hide evidence if things went wrong." Mason thought of the night's planned search. His horse and saddlebags are still missing. "Yes, and that's significant. If Harding was ambushed, his killer would have taken the horse to prevent the body from being found quickly. But if the saddlebags contained evidence..." Redmond let the implication hang. "I'm working on that," Mason said carefully. "Some people are helping me search likely areas." Redmond's gaze sharpened. "Apache people. Does it matter?" "It matters if they're caught armed on settled land tonight with Blackwood and half the territorial officials in town." Redmond's voice took on an edge of urgency. "I'm trying to help you, Hayes, but you're making it damn difficult. Whatever you're planning, postpone it, at least until Blackwood's reception is over and tensions cool a bit. Mason considered the advice. Postponing made tactical sense, but every day that passed gave Blackwood more time to consolidate his position, to find and destroy any evidence Harding had gathered. And there was Niall to consider. Her trust in him, the risk her people were taking to help. "I'll think about it," he said finally, a non-commitment that didn't satisfy either of them. Redmond studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're a stubborn man, Hayes. Always were according to your reputation." He adjusted his hat. "I've got duties to attend to before the reception. Just remember what I said. Blackwood's men are watching you. Be careful." As the sheriff walked away, Mason felt the weight of observation pressing down on him. Scanning the street casually, he noted several unfamiliar men positioned at strategic points, outside the saloon near the bank, lounging by the hotel. Not obvious, but to a trained scout, their purpose was clear. Watchers. Keeping his movements unhurried, Mason gathered his supplies, mounted his horse, and rode out of town. He took the main trail initially, then cut across country through rocky terrain, where pursuit would be difficult and tracks hard to follow. Years of scouting had taught him how to disappear when necessary, how to use the land itself as both shield and weapon. He reached his ranch by early afternoon, stowed his supplies, and settled in to wait for nightfall. The hours stretched long, filled with preparation and reflection. Mason cleaned his guns again, checked his ammunition, packed a small bag with essentials for the search. Water jerky matches, a length of rope. He studied the crude map he'd drawn of the area where the marshal's body had been found, marking likely hiding spots for a horse or cached supplies. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Mason's thoughts turned to Neil. In just a few days, she had upended his carefully constructed isolation, drawing him back into the world of conflicts and choices he had tried to leave behind. Yet he couldn't bring himself to regret it. There was something about her, a strength and integrity, a shared understanding of what it meant to live between worlds, that resonated deep within him. The red bracelet on his wrist caught the fading light, the single blue bead gleaming like a tiny eye. Mason touched it, remembering her fingers weaving the threads, imagining the thoughts that might have accompanied each knot in turn. A connection freely given, a trust he was determined not to betray. Twilight deepened into dusk. Mason saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that had carried him faithfully for years. The animal sensed his mood, standing quietly as he checked the cinch and secured his rifle in its scabbard. As he mounted, Mason cast one last look at his small cabin, the home he had built with his own hands, the refuge he had sought after the canyon. Tonight's actions might well cost him this place of safety, this hard-won peace. But some prices were worth paying. Some silences had endured too long. He rode toward Sacred Water Creek as true night fell, the stars emerging like scattered diamonds across the velvet sky. The moon, nearly full, cast enough light to see by silvering the landscape into a ghostly version of itself. Mason kept to the shadows where possible, alert for any sign of watchers. At the juniper tree, he dismounted and waited, one hand resting on his horse's neck, the other near his holstered revolver. The night sounds wrapped around him. The soft gurgle of the creek, the distant call of a coyote, the whisper of wind through the juniper's branches. He breathed deeply, centering himself as he had done before, countless scouting missions, emptying his mind of everything but the immediate present. A soft whistle came from across the creek, 3 notes rising and falling like a mourning dove's call. Mason answered with the same pattern, then led his horse across the shallow water. On the far bank, a figure materialized from the shadows. Not Neol, but a young Apache man, perhaps 20 years old, with the lean, watchful look of a hunter. "I am Tarak," the young man said in careful English. "Neol's cousin. I will guide you." Mason nodded. "Lead on." They rode in silence, Tarak setting a pace that balanced speed with caution. The young Apache led them away from established trails, following game paths and dry washes that offered concealment. Mason noted the skill in his movements, the easy way he read the land even in darkness. A born scout. After perhaps an hour, they crested a low ridge and looked down into a small valley. In the moonlight, Mason could make out a cluster of wickiups and several larger structures. A small Apache settlement nestled against the protective embrace of a rocky hillside. Cooking fires glowed like earthbound stars, and the soft sounds of voices and movement drifted up to them. Tarak raised a hand, signaling a halt. "We wait here," he said. "They will come to us." Mason dismounted, letting his horse graze on the sparse grass. Tarak did the same, then settled on a boulder, his rifle across his knees. The young man's posture was alert, but not tense, his dark eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "You fought with the White Eyes against my people," Tarak said suddenly, his voice neutral. "I was a scout," Mason replied. "I guided troops, tracked raiders. Yet Neil trusts you." The statement held a question within it. We have a connection through past events. Tarek nodded slowly. The canyon. My mother's sister died there with many others. The familiar weight of guilt pressed down on Mason. I'm sorry, I tried to stop it. So Niall has said. Tarek studied him in the moonlight. It is strange. Among my people, a man's enemies are his son's enemies and his son's sons. Blood debts pass through generations. And among my people, too often enough, Mason acknowledged. Yet here we sit, you and I, preparing to fight together. Tarek's expression was thoughtful. Perhaps the old ways must change if any of us are to survive. Before Mason could respond, movement caught his eye. 3 riders approaching from the direction of the settlement. As they drew near, he recognized Niall in the lead, followed by 2 men, one elderly, one middle-aged. All were armed, the weapons carried openly but not threateningly. Niall dismounted first, approaching Mason with a nod of greeting. She wore buckskin leggings and a dark shirt, her hair braided and wrapped close to her head. Practical attire for the night's work. The silver medallion gleamed at her throat. You came, she said simply. I said I would. She gestured to her companions, my grandfather Hojo and my uncle Kichi. The elderly man Hojo studied Mason with keen eyes that belied his age. He spoke in Apache, his voice deep and resonant with authority. Niall translated. He says you have the look of a man who has seen too much death and carried too many secrets, but also the look of one who seeks to right old wrongs. Mason inclined his head respectfully. Tell him I am honored to meet him and that his granddaughter has shown me great trust that I hope to honor in return. When Niall translated, a hint of a smile touched Hojo's weathered face. He spoke again, gesturing toward the east. He says we must move quickly. Niall translated. Our scouts report the marshal's horse may be hidden in a box canyon 3 miles from here. A white man's saddle was spotted by hunters 2 days ago, but they did not investigate closely, fearing it was a trap. A wise precaution, Mason agreed. Who else knows of this search? Only those you see here and 2 more who watch the approaches to our village. Niall's expression was serious. We trust few with such matters, especially now. Mason nodded, understanding the risk they were taking by including him. Then we should go. The night won't last forever. They mounted and rode East Kitchi in the lead, followed by Mason and Niall, with Tarek and Hojo bringing up the rear. The formation spoke of experience and caution, a hunting party alert for danger from any direction. As they rode, Mason found himself acutely aware of Niall beside him. In the moonlight, her profile was sharply defined, proud and resolute. She rode with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle, her movements in perfect harmony with her horses. Your grandfather, Mason said quietly, he is an important man among your people. He is a medicine man and a member of the tribal council, Niall replied. In his youth, he was a renowned warrior. Now he is valued for his wisdom. And he approves of this, of working with me. Niall glanced at him, a hint of amusement in her eyes. He was skeptical, until I told him the full story of the canyon, of my sister and her child, of the medallion you gave that has now returned to you through me. Mason touched the pendant at her throat. Not returned fully. You still wear it. It belongs with the story now, neither fully yours nor mine. Her voice softened. Some things are meant to be shared, Mason Hayes, even across boundaries. The simple truth of her words resonated within him, touching something long buried. For 6 years, he had lived alone with his memories of the canyon, his guilt and regret sealed away like a festering wound. Now, through Niall, that wound was being exposed to air and light. Painful, yes, but perhaps necessary for true healing. Their path led them through increasingly rugged terrain, following a dry wash that cut between towering rock formations. The landscape here was ancient and alien, shaped by water and wind into fantastic sculptures that loomed against the star-filled sky. Mason recognized the strategic value of the route. It offered concealment and multiple escape paths if they encountered trouble. After nearly an hour, Kitchi raised his hand, signaling a halt. They had reached the mouth of a narrow canyon, its walls rising steeply on either side. He dismounted and spoke quietly to Niall, who translated for Mason. The horse was seen near the back of this canyon, where there is a small spring. We will continue on foot. Tarek will stay with the horses. Mason nodded, retrieving his rifle from its scabbard. The 4 of them, Mason, Niall, Kitchi, and Hojo, moved forward on foot, keeping to the shadows along the canyon walls. The moonlight created a patchwork of silver and black, illuminating some areas while leaving others in complete darkness. They had gone perhaps 200 yards when Mason detected a scent on the breeze, the unmistakable smell of a dead horse. He gestured to the others, pointing to his nose, then forward. Kitchi nodded grimly, and they proceeded with increased caution, weapons ready. The horse lay in a small clearing near the back of the canyon, its body bloated and beginning to decompose. From the remains of the saddle and bridle, Mason could tell it had been a well-equipped mount, suitable for a federal marshal on extended patrol. But what caught his attention was the manner of death, a single bullet hole in the animal's head. A mercy killing, not an attack. Someone shot it cleanly, he murmured to Neil, after unsaddling it. They searched the area carefully, finding evidence that someone had camped here briefly, the remains of a small fire, a discarded tin can, boot prints in the soft earth near the spring. But of the saddlebags there was no sign. Hojo moved around the perimeter of the clearing, examining the ground and nearby rock faces with the intense focus of an experienced tracker. Eventually he called softly to the others, pointing to a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, partly concealed by a stunted juniper. Mason approached, seeing immediately what had caught the old man's attention. Scuff marks on the rock, a broken branch on the juniper, signs that someone had recently accessed the crevice. He drew his knife and carefully probed the opening, alert for traps or unwelcome occupants like rattlesnakes. Finding nothing threatening, he reached deeper into the crevice, his fingers encountering something soft and manufactured. Leather. With careful movements, he withdrew a pair of saddlebags, dust-covered but intact, the leather still supple and strong. "This is it," he said, excitement building as he examined the bags. A small brass plate on the flap bore the initials J.H. James Harding. They gathered around as Mason opened the bags, revealing clothes, basic supplies, in a small metal box secured with a padlock. Mason examined the lock, simple but effective without the key. "We need to open this," he said, looking to the others, "but carefully. If it contains what we hope, we can't damage the contents." Kitchi produced a set of small tools from a pouch at his belt, slender metal picks and hooks that spoke of skills beyond hunting and tracking. At Mason's raised eyebrow, Neil explained, "My uncle was taught by a Mexican locksmith who sought refuge with our people many years ago. The skill has proven useful." Kitchi worked on the lock with practiced patience, his weathered hands steady despite their task. After several minutes, there was a soft click and the padlock sprang open. Mason removed it carefully and lifted the lid of the box. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, several folded documents with official seals, and a small velvet pouch. Mason opened the journal, first finding page after page of neat handwriting. Names, dates, locations, detailed notes of conversations and observations. He skimmed quickly, recognizing immediately the methodical documentation of a lawman building a case. "This is it," he said, excitement coloring his voice. "Harding's evidence against Blackwood. Land fraud, bribery of officials, illegal seizure of Apache territory." He turned more pages, his excitement fading into something colder as he reached entries dated shortly before the marshal's death. And more. Much more. Neil leaned closer. "What is it?" Mason's jaw tightened. "The Canyon Massacre. Harding found witnesses, other soldiers who were there. He had affidavits, sworn statements about what really happened, about Blackwood's orders." He looked up at her, emotions warring within him. He was building a case not just for land fraud, but for murder. Hojo spoke, his voice grave, and Neil translated. "My grandfather says we must take these documents to a place of safety. They are dangerous to possess, but too valuable to destroy." "He's right," Mason agreed, replacing the journal in the box. "Blackwood would kill to prevent this information from becoming public." He opened the velvet pouch, finding a heavy gold watch and a small leather folder containing a photograph of a woman and young boy. Harding's family, most likely. Personal effects the marshal had concealed along with his evidence, perhaps fearing he wouldn't return to claim them. A wave of cold anger washed through Mason. Harding had been a good man, doing his duty, building a case methodically and legally. And Blackwood had had him murdered for it, just as he had tried to silence Mason years ago. Just as he had ordered the deaths of women and children in the canyon. Some men deserved justice. Some deserved retribution. As they carefully repacked the saddlebags, a sound echoed through the canyon. The distant but unmistakable report of a rifle shot, followed by a second. A warning from Tarak. "We've been followed," Mason said, securing the metal box in the saddlebags and slinging them over his shoulder. "We need to move now." They retreated quickly toward the canyon entrance, keeping to the shadows, moving as silently as their urgency allowed. Mason's mind raced through options. Who had followed them? Blackwood's men. The army? How many were there, and how much did they know? As they neared the mouth of the canyon, a figure appeared running toward them. Tarak, his rifle in hand, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Riders," he gasped in Apache, which Neil quickly translated. 6, maybe 7. "White men with rifles. They have our horses." Mason cursed under his breath. Without mounts, they were trapped in the canyon, easy targets for armed men who could simply wait them out. He scanned the steep walls, looking for a climbing route, but saw nothing manageable in the darkness, especially for Hojo, whose age would make such an escape impossible. Is there another way out? He asked Neil. She conferred quickly with Kitchi, then nodded. A game trail near the back of the canyon. It leads up to the ridgeline. Difficult but possible. Then that's our route, Mason decided. But we need a distraction, something to keep them occupied while we escape. Kitchi spoke rapidly, pointing to himself and then toward the canyon entrance. The message was clear, even without translation. He was volunteering to provide the distraction. Mason shook his head. No, I'll do it. I know these men how they think. I can lead them away, maybe circle back to meet you later. It's too dangerous, Neil objected. They'll kill you if they catch you. They'll kill all of us if they trap us here, Mason countered. He handed the saddlebags to her. Take these, get your grandfather and the evidence to safety. That's what matters most. Neil's eyes flashed with emotion, concerned protest, and something deeper that neither of them had time to acknowledge. Where will we meet? The rock shelter, where we talked during the storm, Mason said. I'll find you there tomorrow night if I can. Before she could object further, voices echoed from the canyon entrance, men calling to each other, the metallic sound of weapons being readied. They were out of time. Mason touched the medallion at Neil's throat, a gesture both acknowledgement and promise. Go, now. Kitchi and Tarek helped Hojo toward the back of the canyon, but Neil lingered a moment longer. Be careful, Mason Hayes, she said softly. You carry more than your own life with you now. Then she was gone, melting into the shadows with her people. Mason watched until they disappeared, then turned toward the canyon entrance, drawing his revolver. The saddlebags were secure with Neil. Now he needed to create a distraction, convincing enough to draw their pursuers away from the escaping Apache. Moving quickly to the dead horse, Mason took a handful of dry grass and his matches, creating a small fire that he fed with twigs and branches from the stunted juniper. As the flames caught and grew, he retreated to a position with good cover, sighted his rifle on the canyon entrance, and fired 2 shots into the air. The response was immediate. Shouts, movement, the sound of men taking cover. Mason fired again, this time lower, sending rock fragments spraying as the bullet struck near the canyon mouth. He wanted them pinned down, focused entirely on the threat from his position. Hayes, a voice called out. We know it's you in there. Come out with your Apache friends and no one needs to get hurt. Mason recognized the voice. Captain Ellis, the cavalry officer who had accompanied Blackwood's lawyer in town. So the army was involved after all, or at least elements of it. Not likely, Captain, Mason called back. You didn't ride all this way for a friendly chat. You're harboring fugitives. Hayes interfering with a military investigation. That's a serious offense, even for a former scout. Mason fired again, closer this time, forcing Ellis and his men to keep their heads down. Funny kind of investigation that starts with stealing our horses and shooting at us. While maintaining the verbal exchange, Mason was slowly working his way along the canyon wall, moving from cover to cover, creating the impression that he was still near the campfire while actually circling toward a position that would give him a clear path to the canyon rim. Last chance, Hayes, Ellis shouted. Surrender now or we'll be forced to take action. You want me, Captain? Come and get me. Mason fired once more, then used the echoing report as cover to sprint to his new position, a tumble of boulders that offered both concealment and a route up the canyon wall. The response was as he'd hoped. A fusillade of rifle fire directed at his previous location, followed by shouts and the sound of men advancing into the canyon. By the time they discovered the ruse, Mason was already halfway up the steep slope, climbing with the desperate strength of a man who knew his life depended on each handhold. Gunfire erupted again as someone spotted his movement and bullets whining off rock near his head. Mason pressed himself against the cliff face, finding minimal cover and shadow and irregularities in the stone. When the firing paused, he continued his ascent, muscles burning with the effort, fingers bleeding from the sharp rock. Finally, he hauled himself over the rim, rolling away from the edge just as more bullets struck around him. Without pausing to rest, Mason began running along the ridge line, keeping low to avoid silhouetting himself against the night sky. Behind him, he could hear shouted orders. Ellis organizing his men to pursue some by climbing others, by circling around to cut off his escape. Mason had the advantage of darkness and terrain knowledge, but Ellis had numbers and resources. It would be a close race with his life and possibly Neil's as the stakes. As he ran, the weight of the past and present pressed upon him. The canyon, massacre, Harding's murder. Blackwood's imminent arrival. The evidence now safely with Neil. All paths seemed to be converging, all the scattered threads of his life drawing together towards some inevitable confrontation. But first he had to survive this night, to evade Ellis and his men long enough to rendezvous with Neil and plan their next move. The moonlight guided his way as Mason Hayes disappeared into the vast ancient landscape, a landscape that had witnessed countless such pursuits over centuries. Apache and Spanish Mexican and American, each leaving their mark in blood and memory upon the unforgiving earth. Behind him the shouts grew fainter, the pursuit spreading out in uncertainty. Ahead lay only darkness, danger, and the slim hope of reunion with a woman who had somehow become essential to whatever future awaited him. Dawn found Mason sheltering in a shallow cave high on a rocky slope, his body aching from the night's exertions. He had traveled for hours after escaping the canyon, using every trick he had learned as a scout to confuse his trail, doubling back, walking on bare rock, wading through streams. Eventually confident he had lost his pursuers, he had sought refuge in this hidden spot to rest and plan his next move. From his vantage point, he could see for miles across the territory. The distant smudge of Copper Creek to the west, the rolling grasslands of his ranch, and beyond that, the darker green of the juniper forests that marked the heart of Apache land. Somewhere in that vast landscape, Neil and her family were traveling with Marshall Harding's evidence that could bring down Blackwood and vindicate Mason's long-held accusations about the Canyon Massacre, if they survived to present it to the right authorities. Mason took stock of his situation. His canteen was nearly empty, and he had only a few strips of jerky left from the supplies he'd packed. His rifle had 5 rounds remaining, his revolver a full cylinder of 6. Not much if it came to a protracted fight. His left hand was scraped raw from the climb up the canyon wall, and a bullet had grazed his right arm during the escape, leaving a shallow but painful furrow. Most concerning was his position. Miles from his ranch with Ellis and his men, likely still searching the area. Returning home would be risky. They would certainly watch his property. Yet he needed supplies and his horse if he was to meet Neil as planned. As the sun climbed higher, bringing with it the day's heat, Mason decided his best option was to work his way towards Sacred Water Creek. From there, he could assess the situation more clearly and perhaps approach his ranch after nightfall if it seemed safe. He set out, keeping to high ground where possible, moving from cover to cover with the patient caution of a hunted animal. The landscape baked under the spring sun heat shimmer rising from rock and earth, making distant objects waver and dance in his vision. Mason conserved his water, taking only small sips when absolutely necessary, drawing on years of experience in harsh terrain. By mid-afternoon, he had reached a ridgeline overlooking Sacred Water Creek. Through his rifle scope, he surveyed the area carefully. The juniper tree stood as it always had, the boundary marker between his land and the Apache territory. But now 2 riders circled the area, Blackwood's men judging by their appearance and the methodical way they searched the surroundings. So they knew about the meeting place. Someone was talking. Perhaps someone in town who had observed his comings and goings, or maybe they had simply made the logical assumption that Mason would use the boundary creek for communication with the Apache. Either way, returning to his ranch was now impossible, as was using the juniper tree to leave messages for Neil. His options were narrowing rapidly. Mason retreated from the ridge line and continued his journey, now angling northeast deeper into Apache territory. If he couldn't return home, he would go forward to the rock shelter where he had arranged to meet Neil. It was risky entering further into lands where he had no legal right to be, where any white man might be shot on sight under the current tensions. But he trusted Neil, and through her, perhaps her people would grant him safe passage. The sun was low on the horizon when Mason finally reached the rocky outcropping that concealed the shelter. He approached, cautiously alert for any sign of watchers or traps. The area appeared deserted, the only movement the gentle swaying of grass in the evening breeze. The shelter itself was empty, showing no evidence of recent occupation. Mason had expected this. Their meeting was planned for the following night, and Nahiol and her family would be traveling carefully with the precious evidence. He settled in to wait, finding a concealed position with a good view of the approaches, and prepared for a long, vigilant night. Darkness fell, bringing with it a chorus of night sounds. Coyotes calling to each other, across the distance the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the soft hoot of an owl beginning its hunt. The stars emerged one by one until the sky was a vast tapestry of light, the Milky Way, a ghostly road stretching from horizon to horizon. Mason dozed, fitfully waking at every unusual sound, his body tense and ready for flight or fight. The hours passed with excruciating slowness, each moment stretching like drawn wire, taut with anticipation and dread. It was the deepest part of the night when he heard it, the soft scuff of a footfall on stone, deliberately made to alert rather than surprise. Mason drew his revolver and waited, every sense straining into the darkness. "Mason Hayes," a voice spoke from the shadows, not Neil's, but a man speaking English with a heavy Apache accent. "You are far from your boundaries." "I had reasons to cross them," Mason replied, not lowering his weapon. "I'm waiting for Neil." A figure emerged into a patch of moonlight. Kitchy, Neil's uncle, his rifle held ready, but not aimed directly at Mason. Behind him came two more Apache men similarly armed. Neil sent us to find you, Kitchi said. It is not safe to meet as planned. You must come with us now. Where is she? Mason demanded, still wary. At our village with the evidence. Safe for now. Kitchi's expression was grim. But soldiers search the territory. Many soldiers. They say they look for Apache raiders who killed the marshal. They say you helped these raiders. The situation was worse than Mason had feared. Ellis had clearly used the confrontation at the canyon to justify a larger military operation, painting Mason as a collaborator with hostile Apache. It was a narrative that would play well with the territorial authorities, especially with Blackwood's influence behind it. I need to speak with Neil, Mason said, making his decision. I'll come with you. Kitchi nodded once. We have horses waiting, but you must be blindfolded until we reach the village. This is our way with outsiders. Mason understood the precaution. Despite Neil's trust in him, he was still a white man formerly of the cavalry, entering their most protected space. He nodded agreement and allowed one of the men to bind a cloth over his eyes. They led him to the horses and helped him mount, then set off at a steady pace through the darkness. Without sight, Mason's other senses heightened. The rhythm of the horse beneath him, the sound of hooves on different surfaces, the changing sense of the landscape they traversed. His scout's training helped him maintain a rough mental map of their journey, generally northeast through increasingly rough terrain, climbing gradually to higher elevation. After what seemed like hours, they slowed voices called out in Apache, and Mason sensed they had arrived at their destination. Hands helped him dismount, and he was led forward on foot, still blindfolded, over uneven ground. The sounds around him changed. The murmur of voices, the crackle of fires, the bark of a dog quickly silenced. A village coming awake with their arrival. Finally, they stopped. The blindfold was removed, and Mason blinked in the sudden light of a fire. He stood in a circular clearing, surrounded by wickiups in more substantial structures of wood and earth. Apache men, women, and children watched from doorways and around cooking fires, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Before him was a larger structure, a council house, he guessed, its entrance framed by intricately painted hides. From this doorway emerged Hosho Nayol's grandfather, followed by several older men who carried themselves with the dignity of leadership. Last came Neil herself, her face showing relief at the sight of him. You escaped, she said, moving toward him. We feared the worst when we heard gunfire. It was close, Mason admitted. Ellis and his men were determined. Are you all safe? The evidence. Safe, yes. Hidden where only our most trusted know. She gestured to the council house. The elders wish to speak with you. They have questions and concerns. Mason nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He was almost certainly the first white man to enter this village in generations and under circumstances that put everyone at risk. The fact that he hadn't been killed immediately was testament to Neil's influence and Hojo's authority. Inside the council house, a fire burned in a central pit, its smoke rising to escape through an opening in the roof. The elders seated themselves in a semicircle with Hojo at the center. Mason was directed to sit opposite them with Neil beside him to translate. The oldest of the elders spoke first, his voice deep and resonant despite his age. Neil translated her voice, taking on a formal cadence that matched his rhythm. He says you have crossed many boundaries to be here, Mason Hayes. Not just the boundary of land, but of trust, of blood, of history. Such crossings are not made lightly, nor received without question. Another elder spoke, his words sharp and challenging. Neil hesitated slightly before translating. He asked why we should trust a man who once guided soldiers against our people, who wore the same uniform as those who now hunt us like animals. Before Mason could respond, a third elder raised his hand, speaking more moderately. He says actions speak louder than past allegiances. You helped save our people at the canyon. You have helped us now with the marshal's evidence. Perhaps the wind has changed direction. Hojo was the last to speak, his eyes fixed on Mason with penetrating intensity. His speech was longer, more measured, and Neil translated carefully. My grandfather says you stand at a crossroads, Mason Hayes. Behind you lies your old life, your ranch, your solitude, your safety among your own people. Before you lies a path of danger and uncertainty, but also of truth and perhaps redemption. The choice is yours, but once made cannot be unmade. Mason considered his words carefully before responding. These were not meant to be swayed by empty promises or pretty phrases. They had survived decades of broken treaties and false words from white men. Tell them I understand the risk they take by allowing me here, he began. Tell them I do not ask for their trust based on words alone, but offer instead my knowledge and my commitment to justice. For the marshal, for the victims of the canyon, for all who have suffered under men like Blackwood. As Neil translated, Mason saw the elders exchanging glances, evaluating not just his words, but the spirit behind them. I was part of a system that brought death to your people, Mason continued. I cannot change that past, but I can choose a different path now. The evidence we found can bring Blackwood to justice, but only if we work together to place it in the right hands. The oldest elder spoke again, a question that Niall translated with a slight flush to her cheeks. He asks about your relationship with me, whether your loyalty is to justice or to other interests. Mason met the old man's gaze directly. Tell him my loyalty is to truth. The rest. He glanced at Niall, something unspoken passing between them. The rest will find its own path in time. Hojo nodded slowly, then spoke at length. The other elders listened intently, occasionally murmuring agreement or raising questions that he answered with authoritative gestures. Finally, Niall turned to Mason. They have decided. You may stay until it is safe to travel. The evidence will remain hidden here. My grandfather believes we must wait for the right moment to act. When the soldiers have reduced their patrols, when we can find allies among your people who will listen. And Blackwood, Mason asked, he won't stop searching. Not for me, not for the evidence, not for anyone who threatens his plans. We know, Niall said grimly, but we have survived such men before. We will do so again. The meeting concluded with a ritual passing of a pipe, each elder drawing smoke and offering it to the four directions before passing it to Mason. He understood the significance, not acceptance as one of them, but acknowledgement of a temporary alliance, a shared purpose. As they left the council house, the first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains. The village was fully awake now, people going about their morning tasks while casting curious glances at the white man in their midst. Children stared openly until called away by parents' dogs barked challenges that were quickly silenced. Come, Niall said, you need rest and food. My aunt has prepared a place for you. She led him to a small wickiup at the edge of the village, simply furnished with woven mats, blankets, and a few essential items. Outside, an older woman tended a cooking fire, deliberately not looking at Mason as they approached. My father's sister, Niall explained. She lost 2 sons in raids. It is difficult for her to see you here. Mason nodded, understanding. I'll keep my distance, cause no trouble. Rest now, Niall said. We will speak more later when you've recovered your strength. Left alone in the small dwelling, Mason finally allowed his exhaustion to overcome him. The events of the past days, the discovery of the marshal's body, the encounters with Niall, the search for the evidence, the escape from Ellis and his men, all swirled together in a kaleidoscope of images and emotions as he drifted into sleep. His last conscious thought was of Niall's face as she translated for the elders the way her eyes had softened when the question of their relationship arose. Something was growing between them, something neither had named but both recognized. In the midst of danger and conflicting loyalties, it was both complication and comfort. Mason slept deeply, dreamlessly, his body surrendering to the safety that had been so unexpectedly offered in this place, where by all rights he should have been enemy rather than guest. Outside, the village continued its daily rhythms, absorbing his presence, as it had absorbed so many threats and changes over generations of survival against all odds. And somewhere beyond the mountains, Blackwood and his forces were surely plotting their next move in a game whose stakes had suddenly dramatically increased. Mason woke to the sound of children's laughter and the rich aroma of cooking food. For a moment, disorientation gripped him. The unfamiliar surroundings, the sounds of a community rather than his accustomed solitude. Then memory returned, bringing with it the weight of his circumstances. He sat up, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles and the dull throb of his injured arm. Someone had left a clay pot of water and a bundle of clean cloth beside his sleeping mat. Mason used these to wash and bind his wounds as best he could, grateful for the thoughtfulness behind the gesture. Outside, the day was well advanced, the sun high in a cloudless sky. The Apache village bustled with activity, women working at cooking fires or scraping hides, men repairing weapons or crafting tools, children running errands or playing games that mimicked the skills they would need as adults. It was a scene of ordinary life that contrasted sharply with the prevailing image of Apache as merely warriors and raiders. Tarak approached as Mason emerged from the wickiup, offering a wooden bowl filled with a hearty stew of meat and wild vegetables. You slept long, the young man observed. The sun has traveled far since you closed your eyes. I had a busy night, Mason replied with dry understatement, accepting the food gratefully. Thank you for this. They sat together on a log outside the dwelling, Mason eating while Tarak kept him company, seemingly appointed as his guide, or perhaps his guard. The stew was simple but flavorful, heavy with unfamiliar herbs that added depth to the gamey meat. Where is Neil? Mason asked between bites. With the council, Tarek replied. They discuss what to do with the marshal's evidence. Some wish to use it as leverage for new treaty terms. Others want to send it to the territorial governor directly. Neither is a good idea, Mason said, frowning. The evidence needs to go to federal authorities, not territorial ones. Too many local officials are in Blackwood's pocket. Tarek shrugged. This is what Niall argues, but there is much distrust of all white authorities among my people. With good reason. Mason couldn't disagree. The history of federal Apache relations was written in broken promises and bloodshed. What about Redmond, the local sheriff? I believe he could be trusted with this. Perhaps, but how to reach him? Soldiers patrol all trails now. They search your ranch. They watch the town. Tarek's expression grew serious. And there is worse news. Scouts report Blackwood has arrived in Copper Creek with more men. They say he offers rewards for information about you and any Apache seen outside the reservation. The situation was deteriorating faster than Mason had anticipated. With Blackwood personally directing the search and military patrols intensified, their options were narrowing dangerously. The evidence was worthless if they couldn't get it to someone with the authority and integrity to act on it. I need to speak with Neol and the council, Mason said, setting aside the empty bowl. There may be a way, but it will require trust on both sides. Tarek studied him for a moment, then nodded. I will take you to them when they are ready. Until then, it is better if you remain here. Some in the village. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Some remember the canyon too well to welcome your presence. Mason understood. He settled back against the log, conserving his strength while observing the life of the village around him. Most people avoided looking directly at him, though he felt the weight of their awareness. The white man in their midst, a potential danger, a reminder of losses still fresh in memory. The day advanced, shadows lengthening as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Mason used the time to think, to plan, to consider options and contingencies. The situation was complex, with dangers multiplying with each passing hour. Blackwood's forces searching the military involved tensions rising between settlers and Apache, the evidence hidden but useless without a way to leverage it effectively. And underlying it all, the personal element, his growing feelings for Neil, his commitment to finally exposing the truth about the Canyon Massacre, his desire for some measure of redemption after years of silent guilt. It was late afternoon when Tarek returned, accompanied by an older woman who brought more food and fresh water. She avoided meeting Mason's eyes, placing the provisions silently before retreating without a word. The council still debates, Tarek explained. It may be long into the night before they reach agreement. Mason nodded, unsurprised. Apache decision-making was traditionally consensus-based, with all voices heard and considered. It was a thorough process, if not always a swift one. As twilight approached, bringing with it the day's cooling, Neol finally appeared. She looked tired, the strain of the ongoing discussions evident in the set of her shoulders and the tightness around her eyes. Yet she still carried herself with that innate dignity that had struck Mason from their first meeting. Walk with me, she said, not quite a request, but not quite a command either. They moved away from the center of the village, following a narrow path that led to a small rise overlooking the surrounding landscape. In the fading light, the view was spectacular. Rolling grasslands giving way to forested hills, distant mountains silhouetted against the darkening sky. The land that both their peoples claimed, each in their own way. The council is divided, Neil said without preamble. Some trust your intentions, others do not. Some believe the evidence should be used for immediate advantage, others for long-term justice. And you, Mason asked, what do you believe? She turned to face him, her expression serious in the gathering dusk. I believe in justice, but I also believe in survival. My people have sacrificed much for abstract principles that turned to dust in their hands. This evidence is different, Mason argued. It's concrete proof of criminal acts, fraud, murder, conspiracy. Even Blackwood's political connections can't protect him from that if it reaches the right authorities. If, Neol emphasized, a small word carrying a great weight of doubt. She sighed and looking out over the darkening land. My grandfather believes you. He says your eyes carry the truth of your words, but others fear this is merely another trap, another promise that will break when tested. Mason moved closer to her, close enough to see the fine details of her face in the failing light. I can't undo generations of betrayal, Neol. I can only offer what I have now, my knowledge, my skills, my commitment. He hesitated on the last word, aware of the deeper currents flowing beneath their conversation. Your commitment, she repeated softly, to justice, to truth, or to something else. The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Mason found himself at a rare loss for words, the familiar territory of tactical decisions and practical plans giving way to something more personal, more vulnerable. All of those, he said finally, and more that I'm still coming to understand. Neil held his gaze for a long moment, something softening in her expression. Then she looked away back toward the village where firelight now glowed against the gathering darkness. I have a proposal for the council, she said, one that may satisfy both caution and action, but it requires your complete cooperation and it carries great risk. Tell me, Mason said simply. We send the evidence to Sheriff Redmond through a trusted intermediary, someone who can move between our worlds without arousing immediate suspicion. Meanwhile, you remain here under our protection. I should be the one to take it, Mason objected. It's my responsibility, my fight as much as yours. Neil shook her head. You are hunted by both Blackwood's men and the military. Every trail is watched, every approach to town monitored. You would never get through. Then who, Mason pressed? Who is this intermediary you trust with something so important? Widow Thornton, Neil said, surprising him completely. Mrs. Thornton, the storekeeper? Mason stared in disbelief. She hates the Apache. Her husband was killed in a raid years ago. By Chiricahua, not our band, Neil clarified. And her hatred is complicated. What is not widely known is that before her marriage, Abigail Thornton was a teacher at the mission school where my mother learned English. They were friends of a sort until society forced them apart. Mason absorbed this unexpected information. And you believe this old connection is enough to trust her with evidence that could get her killed if Blackwood discovered her involvement. I believe people contain multitudes, Mason Hayes. Just as you are both the scout who led soldiers against my people and the man who tried to prevent a massacre. Neil's gaze was steady. Mrs. Thornton still corresponds with the mission. She sends supplies medicines. She has helped quietly when Apache children were sick, though she would never admit it publicly. The complexity of frontier relationships never ceased to surprise Mason. Lines that seem clear and absolute from a distance reveal themselves up close to be permeable, shifting human. Even if you're right about her, he said, how do you propose to contact her? As you said, every approach to town is watched. She comes to the old mission ruins every second Tuesday to leave supplies for the priest who travels the territory. It is a pattern long established, one that would not arouse suspicion. Neil's voice took on a note of urgency. The next Tuesday is tomorrow. We must decide tonight if this is our course. Mason considered the plan, weighing its risks and possibilities. It was dangerous placing so much trust in someone whose loyalties were uncertain at best. Yet the alternatives seemed even more perilous, attempting to break through the patrols himself or waiting until Blackwood's net closed even tighter around them all. If the council agrees to this, he said slowly, I have conditions of my own. I want to meet with Mrs. Thornton personally to judge her reaction, to explain the importance of what we're asking. And I want a backup plan in case she refuses or betrays us. Neil nodded. Fair terms. Will you speak to the council? They will listen more readily to the plan from your own lips. I will, Mason agreed, though my Apache is somewhat limited. A smile touched Neil's lips, the first he had seen since his arrival at the village. I will translate. Though I warn you, some concepts do not cross between our languages easily. Justice, for instance, has many shades of meaning among my people that your tongue cannot capture. As does honor, Mason replied, and loyalty. They stood together on the hillside as true night fell, the first stars appearing overhead like distant campfires. Below, the village lights glowed warm and inviting, a pocket of human community in the vast wilderness. For a moment, Mason felt a profound sense of peace despite the dangers surrounding them, a recognition that here now he was exactly where he needed to be. Neil's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his own. The touch was simple, profound, a connection across boundaries of race and history, a silent acknowledgement of what was growing between them. Come, she said softly, the council waits, and the night grows no younger, while we stand here. Together they descended toward the firelit circle where the elders gathered their joined hands, a bridge between worlds that had too long been separated by misunderstanding and blood. Whatever came next, whether triumph or tragedy, justice or further betrayal, they would face it not as Apache and white, not as representatives of opposed peoples, but as two individuals who had found in each other something worth fighting for. The council fire cast long shadows as they approached the faces of the elders, solemn and expectant in the flickering light. Mason felt the weight of history and possibility pressing down, knew that decisions made this night would ripple outward in ways none of them could fully predict. Yet for the first time in years, he faced uncertainty without the crushing burden of isolation. Whatever came, he would not face it alone. That knowledge gave him strength as he stepped forward into the circle of light, ready to plead his case to men who had every reason to distrust him, yet had offered shelter when he most needed it. The night stretched ahead, filled with difficult conversations and harder choices. But beneath it all ran a current of hope. Fragile, perhaps, but real. A hope that truth might finally prevail over power, that old wounds might begin to heal, that boundaries once thought impassable might prove to be merely human constructions after all. And in Neol's eyes, as she began to translate his words to her people, Mason saw that same hope reflected, a light no darkness could entirely extinguish. The council meeting lasted deep into the night, voices rising and falling around the central fire as arguments were made, concerns raised, and Mason's proposal dissected from every angle. He spoke with as much honesty as he could muster, answering questions directly, acknowledging the risks, while emphasizing the potential for justice that the marshal's evidence represented. Neol translated tirelessly, her voice maintaining its calm, authoritative tone even as the hours stretched on. Mason marveled at her stamina and diplomacy, the way she navigated the complex currents of tribal politics, while ensuring his words carried their intended weight. Throughout the discussion, Hojo sat mostly silent, his weathered face revealing little of his thoughts. It was only near midnight, when the debate had circled back upon itself several times, that the old medicine man finally raised his hand for attention. The circle fell silent immediately, a mark of the respect he commanded. He spoke for several minutes, his voice soft yet carrying his Apache words flowing like water over stone, smooth, powerful, inexorable. Mason understood little of the actual language, but the effect was unmistakable. Heads nodded, expressions shifted from doubt to consideration. When he finished, Neol turned to Mason, her eyes bright in the firelight. "My grandfather has spoken in favor of your plan. He says a tree that cannot bend will break in the storm. Our people have survived by knowing when to stand firm and when to adapt." One by one, the other elders spoke shorter now, offering their assent, or at least their willingness to try the proposed course. Not all were enthusiastic, but the consensus was building toward action rather than continued hiding. Finally, the oldest elder raised both hands, signaling the end of deliberation. He spoke a brief pronouncement that Niall translated with evident relief. "It is decided. We will attempt to pass the evidence to Widow Thornton tomorrow. Tarak and I will make the approach. You will remain hidden nearby to speak with her if she seems receptive." Neil's expression was solemn. "If she betrays us, we must be prepared to flee immediately and find another way." Mason nodded, acutely aware of the trust being placed in him in his judgment of Mrs. Thornton's character. "I understand. Thank you for this chance." The council dispersed, elders returning to their dwellings, while younger men moved to take up guard positions around the village perimeter. The night was now well advanced, the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human dramas playing out beneath them. Neol walked with Mason back to his allocated shelter, both of them weary from the long negotiations, yet oddly energized by the decision to act. "Your grandfather," Mason said as they walked, "he has great influence." "He has seen much in his long life," Neol replied. "War and peace, feast and famine. He remembers when the Spanish still claimed this land before the Americans came." Her voice softened. "He says you have an old soul for a white man, that your eyes have seen more death than your years should allow." Mason thought of the canyon, of the other battles and skirmishes during his scouting days, of the violence that seemed to follow the advance of civilization like a shadow. Perhaps he's right. They stopped outside the wickiup, the small fire nearby reduced to glowing embers that cast just enough light to see by. Around them, the village settled into night's rhythms. Soft voices from nearby dwellings, the cry of a baby quickly hushed the distant howl of a coyote, answered by one of the camp dogs. "You should rest," Neol said. "Tomorrow will test us all." Mason caught her hand as she turned to go, the touch gentle but intentional. "Thank you," he said simply, "for trusting me, for helping me make them trust me too." Neol looked down at their joined hands, then back to his face. Something shifted in her expression, a softening of vulnerability rarely allowed to surface. "Perhaps I trust you because I see in you what I feel in myself," she said quietly, "the weight of being between worlds, not fully belonging to either, yet bound to both." Her fingers tightened briefly around his. "It is a lonely path." "It doesn't have to be," Mason replied, the words emerging before he had fully formed the thought behind them. "Lonely, I mean." The implication hung in the night air between them, neither acknowledged nor denied. Neol's eyes held his for a long moment, dark pools reflecting starlight and ember glow. "Sleep well, Mason Hayes," she said finally, gently withdrawing her hand. "Dawn comes whether we are ready or not." He watched her walk away, her silhouette gradually merging with the shadows between dwellings until she was gone from sight. Only then did he duck into the wickiup, settling onto the sleeping mat with a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. Tomorrow would bring action after days of reaction, a chance to take control of their fate rather than merely responding to Blackwood's moves. It was a risk, certainly, perhaps their greatest yet, but somehow the burden felt lighter for being shared. Mason touched the red bracelet still circling his wrist, the single blue bead, a darker shadow against the threads. From that first encounter at the creek to this moment, something had been building between him and Neol. Something neither of them had named, but both increasingly acknowledged, through gesture and glance, through trust, given and received. Sleep came swiftly, pulling him down into dreams of running water and wind through juniper branches, of hands joined across boundaries that dissolved like morning mist beneath the rising sun. Dawn arrived with soft footsteps outside his shelter and the aroma of brewing coffee, a surprisingly familiar scent in this unfamiliar setting. Mason emerged to find Tarak tending a small fire, a battered coffee pot nestled in the coals. "Neol said you prefer the black drink of the white man to start your day," the young Apache explained, offering a tin cup of the steaming liquid. "We trade for it, sometimes at the mission." Mason accepted gratefully, the rich, bitter taste, a welcome touch of normalcy. "Thank you. Is everything prepared for today's meeting?" "Horses are ready, weapons checked. Scouts report the area around the old mission seems quiet." Tarak's expression remained cautious. "But Blackwood's men are clever. They may hide their presence better than we can detect." It was a valid concern. While Apache scouts were legendary for their tracking and observation skills, Blackwood had resources and manpower that could overwhelm even the most careful approach. "We'll be cautious," Mason assured him. "Multiple observers escape routes planned in advance, and we won't all go together, too obvious a target." Neol joined them as they finished their coffee, dressed for travel in a simple skirt and blouse that blended Apache and white styles, clothing that wouldn't draw immediate attention if glimpsed from a distance. Her hair was braided and wrapped at the nape of her neck, practical and unobtrusive. "The evidence is prepared," she said without preamble. Harding's journal and the most important documents, sealed in oilcloth, easy to conceal or pass quickly if needed. Mason nodded approval. "And the backup plan, if Mrs. Thornton refuses or betrays us?" "My cousin waits near Copper Creek," Neol explained. "If we signal with fire smoke in a certain pattern, he will attempt to contact Sheriff Redmond directly, though this carries greater risk." They spent the next hour reviewing every detail of their plan, timing signals, rendezvous points, and emergency procedures if things went wrong. Mason was impressed by the thoroughness of the preparations, the way the Apache had scouted multiple approaches and escape routes from the old mission. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. The mission ruins lay some 10 miles southwest, a journey of about 2 hours by horseback through increasingly open country as they left the protection of Apache territory. According to Niall, Widow Thornton typically arrived around noon, leaving supplies before returning to town well before nightfall. Mason, Niall, and Tarak would approach separately, converging near the mission from different directions to better spot any watchers or patrols. 2 other young Apache men would range wider, providing advance warning of any military movements in the area. As they prepared to leave, Hojo approached, his steps slow but purposeful. He spoke briefly to Neol, then turned to Mason, studying him with those keen eyes that seemed to look straight through to his soul. To Mason's surprise, the old man extended a closed hand, opening it to reveal a small object, a carved stone bear worn smooth by handling, suspended from a leather thong. "A protection charm," Neol translated as her grandfather pressed it into Mason's palm. "He says the bear walks between worlds, powerful in both, feared in both, yet belonging to neither. Like you, like me." Mason closed his fingers around the small talisman, deeply touched by the gesture. "Tell him I'm honored. I'll carry it with respect." Hojo nodded once, then spoke again, his voice carrying unexpected strength. Neol's translation came softly, her own emotion evident beneath the words. "He says whatever happens today, you have already honored your promise to my sister's memory. The truth will find its way into the light, even if not in the way we expect." With that, the old man turned and walked away, his dignified bearing undiminished by age or circumstance. Mason slipped the bear charm over his head, tucking it beneath his shirt, where it rested cool against his skin. They departed soon after, each taking a different path down from the village. Mason rode southeast, initially planning a wide arc that would bring him to the mission from the direction of his ranch, a route less likely to be watched for Apache movement. The day was warming rapidly, the spring sun climbing a cloudless sky, baking the landscape in heat that shimmered above the distant plains. Mason kept to ravines and dry washes where possible, using the terrain for concealment while maintaining a pace that would bring him to the rendezvous on time. His mind remained alert, scanning constantly for signs of danger, yet beneath this vigilance ran a current of reflection. So much had changed in the brief days since he had discovered Marshall Harding's body. The solitary existence he had built for himself had been shattered. Old wounds reopened, new connections forged. Whatever happened at the mission today, he could never return to the isolation that had defined his life for the past 6 years. Nor he realized with sudden clarity did he want to. The mission came into view just before noon. A simple stone structure, its roof long collapsed, standing in dignified ruin on a small rise surrounded by juniper trees. Once a Spanish outpost for converting the native population, it had been abandoned for decades, visited only by the occasional traveling priest, and apparently Widow Thornton with her mysterious supply deliveries. Mason dismounted in a sheltered arroyo half a mile from the mission, securing his horse before continuing on foot. He moved with the ingrained caution of a scout, using every bit of cover freezing. At the slightest unusual sound, his senses stretched to their limits. He reached his designated observation point, a cluster of boulders with good sight lines to both the mission and the trail from town, without incident. Through his rifle scope, he carefully scanned the area looking for any sign of ambush or surveillance. The mission stood silent in the noon heat, lizards basking on its sun-warmed stones, the only visible movement. A soft whistle from his left, the call of a canyon wren but slightly off in its pattern, signaled Niall's arrival at her position. Minutes later, a similar sound from the right indicated Tarek was also in place. The 3 points of their triangle now complete, they settled in to wait for Widow Thornton's arrival. The sun crawled slowly across the sky, the heat intensifying until the air seemed to waver visibly. Mason sipped sparingly from his canteen, conserving water while keeping his focus sharp. A hawk circled lazily overhead, riding thermal currents, its keen eyes perhaps noting the hidden humans, but showing no particular interest in their presence. It was approaching 1 o'clock when a cloud of dust appeared on the trail from town, a single rider approaching at a steady pace. Through his scope, Mason confirmed it was indeed Abigail Thornton riding a sturdy brown mare and leading a pack horse laden with supplies. She wore a practical riding dress of dark blue cotton, a wide-brimmed hat shading her face from the relentless sun. He watched as she reached the mission, dismounting with the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to handling herself in the wilderness. She began unloading packages from the pack horse, arranging them inside the remaining corner of the mission where walls and a partial roof still provided some shelter from the elements. Another bird call, Neil signaling that her scouts reported no other riders or patrols in the vicinity. It was time. Mason rose from his hiding place, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he stepped into the open. Mrs. Thornton's back was to him as she arranged the supplies, unaware of his presence until he spoke. "Mrs. Thornton!" She whirled her hand, darting toward a pocket in her skirt, reaching for a concealed weapon, Mason realized. Her eyes widened in recognition, fear quickly replaced by wary suspicion. "Hayes, what in God's name are you doing here?" Her gaze darted around, searching for others. "Everyone's looking for you. They're saying you killed that marshal that you've joined up with Apache raiders." "You know that's not true," Mason said, keeping his voice calm, his hands visible and empty. "You've known me for 6 years. Have I ever seemed like a murderer to you?" She hesitated, her hand still near the hidden weapon but not drawing it. "What people seem and what they are can be different things." "True enough," Mason acknowledged, "which is why I'm here, to speak with you about appearances and reality." Mrs. Thornton's eyes narrowed. "You're alone." "For now," Mason replied, not quite a lie. "But I have allies nearby." Understanding dawned in her expression. "Apache," she said flatly. "So that part of the rumors is true at least." "I need your help, Mrs. Thornton," Mason said, deciding directness was his best approach. "There's evidence, proof of who really killed Marshal Harding, proof of land fraud and worse crimes, evidence that needs to reach Sheriff Redmond." "And why would I help you?" she demanded, though something in her tone had shifted slightly. "Why would I risk everything I've built?" "Because you once cared about justice," came Neol's voice as she emerged from concealment, walking slowly toward them, with empty hands held slightly away from her sides. "Because you once called my mother friend." Mrs. Thornton went very still, her face draining of color as she stared at Neol. "Who are you?" she whispered, though her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. "I am Neol, daughter of Tani, who was called Hannah at the mission school. You taught her to read English books. You gave her a red scarf on her 16th birthday." Neol moved closer, her steps measured and careful. "She never forgot your kindness, even after your paths diverged." The widow's hand finally fell away from her hidden weapon, her shoulder sagging slightly. "Hannah," she murmured. "I didn't know she had a daughter. I didn't know if she even survived after." She trailed off, old memories clearly surfacing. "After she chose my father and was cast out by your people." Neol finished for her. "Yes, she survived. She taught me what you taught her when reading, writing, the power of words to bridge worlds." Mrs. Thornton looked between them, calculation and memory warring in her expression. "What is this evidence you speak of, and why bring it to me of all people?" Mason gestured toward a shaded area beside the mission wall. "Perhaps we could sit." It's a complicated story and time is short. After a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Thornton nodded. The three of them settled in the narrow band of shade, Mason and Neil taking turns to explain the events of the past days. The discovery of Harding's body, the connection to Blackwood, the search for and finding of the marshal's journal and documents. As they spoke, Tarak remained hidden, watching the approaches to the mission for any sign of danger. The conversation flowed more easily than Mason had dared hope, Mrs. Thornton listening with increasing focuses as the full picture emerged. Blackwood, she said when they had finished. I've never trusted the man for all his talk of progress and prosperity. Too smooth by half. She frowned thoughtfully. But these are serious accusations. Murder, fraud, conspiracy. The marshal's evidence would need to be overwhelming to stand against a man of his connections. It is, Neil assured her. Names, dates, sworn statements from witnesses. Enough to convince even the most skeptical judge if it reaches the right hands. Mrs. Thornton was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant as she weighed her options. Finally, she looked directly at Neil. Your mother, did she have a good life with your father? Not an easy life, Neil replied honestly, but one of love and purpose. She never regretted her choice even when it brought hardship. Something resolved in the widow's face. Very well, I'll take your evidence to Redmond. He's a good man, whatever his limitations. She fixed Mason with a stern look. But understand this, I do it for Hannah's daughter and for justice, not for you, Hayes. And if this is some elaborate trap, may God have mercy on your soul, because I certainly won't. No trap, Mason assured her. Just truth that's been buried too long. Neil produced the oilcloth package from inside her clothing, handling it with reverence before passing it to Mrs. Thornton. The journal is most important. The documents support and extend its accusations. The widow tucked the package securely into her saddlebag, her movements brisk and efficient. I'll see Redmond tonight privately. He usually takes his dinner alone at the hotel. She mounted her horse with surprising agility for a woman of her years. What about you two? Where will you go now? Best you don't know, Mason replied. Safer for everyone that way. Mrs. Thornton nodded, understanding the logic. She gathered her reins, then paused, looking down at Neil. You have her eyes, she said softly. Hannah's eyes. She was the brightest student I ever taught. With that, she turned her horse and rode back toward town, the pack horse following obediently behind. Mason and Niall watched until she disappeared from view, the dust of her passing settling slowly in the heat-soaked air. Do you think she'll deliver it? Niall asked, uncertainty creeping into her voice for the first time. Yes, Mason said with conviction. Whatever else she may be, Mrs. Thornton is a woman of her word, and seeing you, connecting you to your mother, that sealed it. They returned to their horses, rejoining Tarakak for the journey back to Apache territory. As they rode, Mason felt a curious mixture of relief and tension. Relief that the evidence was finally moving toward proper authorities, tension because the most dangerous phase of their plan was now beginning. Once Blackwood realized his crimes had been documented and exposed, he would stop at nothing to silence those responsible. The afternoon was waning when they crested a ridge and saw smoke rising in the distance. Not the thin wisp of cooking fires, but thick black columns that spoke of destruction. The village, Neil gasped, spurring her horse forward. They rode hard caution, abandoned in the face of clear disaster. As they drew closer, the extent of the attack became apparent. Several wickiups, burning horses, scattered signs of a brief but violent struggle, evident in trampled earth and scattered belongings. They dismounted at the edge of the village, weapons ready, moving forward with desperate caution. Bodies lay where they had fallen, 3 Apache men obviously killed while defending their homes. Of the remaining villagers, there was no immediate sign. Grandfather Niall whispered, running toward Hosho's dwelling, which stood intact though its contents had been ransacked. Mason followed, heart pounding with dread. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Someone had led Blackwood's men here, someone had betrayed them while they were meeting with Mrs. Thornton. They found Kitchi Niall's uncle slumped against a tree, a bullet wound in his shoulder but still alive. His eyes fluttered open as Neil knelt beside him. Soldiers, he gasped in Apache, which Neil translated for Mason. With other men, not in uniform. They came just after you left, looking for the white man for the evidence. My grandfather, Neil asked, fear evident in her voice. Taken, with the others who survived. They said, Kitchi winced in pain. They said they would hold them until the evidence was returned, until you and the white man surrendered. Cold fury washed through Mason. This was Blackwood's way, using innocence as leverage, threatening those unable to defend themselves. It was the canyon all over again, power wielded without conscience or restraint. How many were there? He asked as Neil tended her uncle's wound. 12, perhaps 15, Kitchi replied through gritted teeth. Captain Ellis led them. And another, a man in fine clothes who gave the orders but did not dirty his hands. Blackwood, Mason said grimly. He's taking direct control now, not trusting intermediaries. They stabilized Kitchi as best they could, then searched the village for other survivors who might have hidden or escaped the initial attack. They found two elderly women concealed in a storage pit and a young boy who had fled into the surrounding forest, but returned when he recognized Neol's voice. From these survivors, a clearer picture emerged. The attack had been swift and coordinated, clearly planned in advance. The soldiers had surrounded the village before attacking, cutting off escape routes. They had killed only those who actively resisted, taking the rest, including Hojo, as prisoners. Before leaving, Captain Ellis had delivered Blackwood's message. The hostages would be held at the army camp near Copper Creek until Mason Niole and the marshal's evidence were surrendered. It was the boy, one of the old women said, anger mixing with grief in her voice. The one who brings messages from the mission. He must have been watching, must have reported back to the white men. Mason remembered the Apache boy who had delivered Neol's message to him in town days earlier. If he had been compromised, followed, or somehow turned informant, it would explain how Blackwood had known to strike while they were away. Night was falling as they completed their grim assessment of the situation. The village was damaged but not destroyed. The dead would need proper burial, the wounded care, the scattered livestock gathering. And decisions, difficult, perhaps impossible decisions, would need to be made about how to respond to Blackwood's ultimatum. Mason found Niole sitting alone beside one of the untouched cooking fires, her face set in lines of grief and determination. He settled beside her, close enough for support, but not crowding her in her moment of private anguish. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "This is my fault. I brought this danger to your people." "No," she replied, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "Blackwood brought this danger. He has been bringing it for years to my people, to yours, to anyone who stands in the path of his ambition." She looked at him directly. "We chose this fight together, Mason Hayes. Now we must see it through together." "The evidence is beyond our reach now," Mason pointed out. "With Mrs. Thornton, hopefully with Redmond by now, we can't surrender it even if we wanted to. Which leaves us with few options." Neol's expression hardened. "Blackwood expects us to give ourselves up in exchange for the hostages. He will kill us and then kill them anyway once he realizes we no longer have the journal." Mason nodded grimly. It was a calculation he had already made, one that left a bitter taste in his mouth. "We need another approach, one Blackwood won't anticipate." They sat in silence for a time, the fire crackling between them, each lost in thought as the weight of responsibility pressed down. Around them, the surviving village members moved quietly, tending the wounded, securing what remained of their homes, united in grief and uncertainty. Finally, Mason spoke, his voice low but resolute. "I have an idea. It's dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than surrendering, but it might be our only chance to save your grandfather and the others." Neol listened intently as he outlined his plan, a desperate gambit that would require perfect timing, unwavering courage, and more than a little luck. When he finished, he was silent for a long moment, weighing the risks against the slim hope of success. "My grandfather would say that when the path ahead disappears, sometimes one must make a new trail," she said finally. "This is such a time." She reached for Mason's hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We will do this together, or not at all." In the flickering firelight, their joined hands cast a single shadow on the ground between them. No longer separate shapes, but one unified form, a visual echo of the bond that had formed through shared danger and growing trust. Mason felt a surge of something powerful and unfamiliar, not just determination or resolve, but a deeper connection that transcended the immediate crisis. Whatever happened in the coming days, whatever price they paid for standing against Blackwood, he would not regret this moment, this choice, this woman whose courage matched his own. Together, he agreed, tightening his grip on her hand. Until the end, whatever it may be. The fire burned low as they refined their plan, identifying each risk, planning for contingencies, preparing for both success and failure. Around them, the night deepened, stars emerging in their thousands across the vast desert sky. The same stars that had witnessed countless human struggles in this ancient land. The same stars that would continue their eternal wheeling long after this particular conflict was resolved one way or another. Dawn would bring action, danger, the culmination of events set in motion days ago beside a boundary creek. But for now, in this moment of connection and shared purpose, Mason and Niole found a kind of peace. The peace of those who have chosen their path with clear eyes and full hearts, whatever the cost might be. The army camp outside Copper Creek was a model of military efficiency. Tents arranged in neat rows, sentries posted at regular intervals, lanterns illuminating the perimeter against the gathering dusk. From their vantage point on a ridge half a mile away, Mason and Neil had a clear view of the activity below. There, Mason said, pointing to a larger tent set slightly apart from the others. That's likely where Blackwood is headquartered, and those two wagons with the guards. That's where they were holding the prisoners. Neil nodded, studying the layout through Mason's spyglass. Many soldiers, more than we expected. It was true. In addition to the regular cavalry troops under Captain Ellis's command, Mason could see at least a dozen men who were clearly not military. Blackwood's private force most likely hired guns dressed as railroad security or mining company employees. It complicates things, he acknowledged, but the plan can still work if we're careful. The basic elements remain the same. And they had spent the day preparing, gathering what resources remained in the damaged village, briefing the small group of Apache warriors who had returned from hunting to find their homes attacked and their families taken. These men, just 5 in total, had agreed to assist despite the overwhelming odds, their desire for revenge, tempered by Neil's insistence on a plan that prioritized rescuing the hostages over inflicting casualties. Now as night approached, the final pieces were being put into place. Tarek and 2 others were already positioned at strategic points around the camp, watching patrol patterns and signal fires ready to be lit at Neil's command. The remaining warriors waited in a ravine below horses and weapons, prepared for the moment when speed would become essential. It's time, Neil said as the sun touched the western horizon. We should move into position before full darkness. Mason nodded, taking one last look at the camp through his spyglass. Something caught his eye. Movement near Blackwood's tent, a figure emerging into the fading light. Even at this distance, he recognized the bearing, the distinctive profile. And Blackwood, he said, a cold certainty settling in his gut. He's here personally overseeing everything. In a way, it was fitting. This confrontation had been building for 6 years, from the Canyon massacre to this moment. The architect of so much suffering, the man whose ambition had left a trail of blood across the territory, he would be present for whatever resolution the night might bring. They descended the ridge carefully, using the lengthening shadows for cover as they made their way toward their designated positions. The plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. Create a diversion on the eastern edge of the camp, draw forces away from the prisoner wagons, then move in quickly to free the hostages during the confusion. Timing would be critical. Too early and the guards would not be sufficiently reduced. Too late and reinforcements might return before the rescue was complete. Everything depended on coordination, on each person performing their role exactly as planned. Mason and Neil separated at the base of the ridge, each heading toward different positions. He to the north of the camp, where he would wait for the signal before approaching the wagons, she'd a rendezvous with Tarak and oversee the diversionary fires. Before they parted, Neil caught Mason's arm, her expression intense in the fading light. Be careful, she said softly. Remember your promise. I remember, he assured her, thinking of their agreement the night before, that neither would sacrifice themselves unnecessarily, that survival remained a priority alongside rescue. You be careful too. She touched the medallion at her throat, then reached up to press her palm briefly against his cheek, a gesture so unexpected and tender that Mason felt it like a physical jolt through his body. Then she was gone, melting into the gathering darkness with the silent grace that had first captivated him at the creek. Mason moved into position, finding the shallow arroyo that would allow him to approach within 100 yards of the prisoner wagons while remaining concealed. Now came the hardest part, waiting, every sense alert for the signal, every muscle tense with readiness. The stars emerged one by one as true night fell, the camp below now defined by lantern light and campfires. Mason could hear the murmur of voices, occasional laughter, the routine sounds of a military encampment settling in for the evening. Nothing to suggest they anticipated trouble, nothing to indicate they suspected rescue might be attempted so soon after the raid. Time stretched, measured only by the slow movement of stars across the velvet sky. Mason controlled his breathing, keeping his mind focused and clear, pushing away thoughts of what might happen if they failed. Discipline had kept him alive through years of scouting hostile territory. It would serve him now in perhaps his greatest challenge. The signal, when it came, was spectacular. 3 fires blooming almost simultaneously along the eastern perimeter of the camp, followed by the sharp reports of rifle fire. Mason watched as soldiers rushed to respond, officers shouting orders, men grabbing weapons and running toward the disturbance. He counted silently, giving the diversion time to draw maximum forces away from the wagons. When he reached 100, he began moving forward, keeping low, using every scrap of cover the terrain provided. The guards at the wagons were reduced now, just 4 men where there had been 8, their attention divided between their prisoners and the commotion at the far side of the camp. Mason circled to approach from the darkest side where the wagon's bulk would help conceal his advance. 50 yards, 40, 30. He froze as a sentry turned in his direction, then relaxed as the man's gaze passed over his position without pausing. 20 yards now. Close enough to see the prisoners. A group of perhaps 15 Apache men, women, and children bound and under guard. Among them, Mason could make out Hojo's distinctive white hair, the old man sitting with straight-back dignity despite his captivity. Mason drew his knife, prepared for silent elimination of the nearest guard, when a new sound cut through the night, hoofbeats approaching rapidly from the direction of town. He pressed himself flatter against the earth as a rider galloped into camp, heading directly for Blackwood's tent. The messenger's arrival caused a stir, guards calling out officers emerging from tents. Even some of the forces dealing with the diversionary fires began returning, alerted by the commotion. Something had changed. Their carefully timed plan was unraveling. From his concealed position, Mason could see Blackwood emerge from his tent to meet the messenger, could see the man dismount and deliver whatever news he carried with urgent gestures. Even at this distance, the effect was visible. Blackwood's posture stiffening, his hand clenching into a fist, his voice rising in what could only be fury. Orders were shouted. Men began moving with new purpose. And to Mason's horror, 4 soldiers approached the prisoner wagons with clear intent, rifles raised. They were going to execute the hostages. Now, whatever news had arrived had changed Blackwood's calculations, had pushed him to eliminate witnesses immediately rather than wait for the exchange he had proposed. Mason had seconds to decide. He could maintain the plan, try to reach the wagons, but he would certainly be spotted before freeing more than a few prisoners. He could retreat, regroup with Niall, but the hostages would die in the meantime. Or he could create a new diversion, a target compelling enough to distract everyone from the immediate execution of the Apache prisoners. The decision made itself. Mason stepped into the open and raised his rifle. "Blackwood," he shouted, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet camp. "I'm here, the man you really want." Every head turned in his direction. Every weapon shifted to target him. Blackwood himself froze, then slowly turned to face the voice from his past. "Hayes," he called back, recognition and something like satisfaction in his tone. "How convenient of you to deliver yourself, though I'd expected you to bring the Apache woman and my property as well." Mason began walking forward, his rifle held non-threateningly across his body, his movements deliberate and calm, despite the dozen or more weapons trained on him. "I came alone," he lied, "to negotiate terms, the evidence for the hostages." Blackwood's laugh was cold, echoing in the night air. "Negotiate? You're hardly in a position to make demands, Hayes. But I admit I'm curious. Where is the Marshal's journal? Where is the Apache witch who helped you steal it?" Mason continued his advance, now close enough to see Blackwood's face clearly in the lantern light. The same hard features he remembered from the canyon, perhaps more lined now, but no less arrogant, no less convinced of his own rightness. "Safe," Mason replied. "Both of them, and they'll remain that way unless these people are released unharmed." He was playing for time now, hoping Cheryl had seen his move, was adapting the plan accordingly. The prisoners were watching him with a mixture of confusion and dawning hope, recognizing perhaps that his appearance offered at least a chance of survival, where moments before there had been none. Blackwood gestured, and 2 soldiers moved to flank Mason, rifles leveled at his chest. "Search him," Blackwood ordered. Rough hands removed his weapons, checked his clothing for hidden documents. "Nothing, sir," one reported. "No papers, no journal." "Of course not," Blackwood sneered. "He's not a complete fool. The journal is hidden somewhere with accomplices ready to deliver it to authorities if he doesn't return." He studied Mason with cold calculation, which presents an interesting problem. Mason remained silent, watching as Blackwood paced a few steps, clearly thinking through his options. Around them, the camp had reorganized. The diversionary fires contained forces consolidated around this unexpected development. "Here's what's going to happen, Hayes," Blackwood said finally. "You're going to tell me exactly where the journal is. You're going to tell me where to find the Apache woman. And then if I'm feeling generous, I might let some of these savages live." He gestured toward the prisoner wagons. "Starting with the old man. I understand he's important to them. Some kind of medicine man." "And if I refuse?" Mason asked, though he knew the answer. Blackwood's smile was thin and merciless. "Then I'll have them shot one by one while you watch, beginning with the children." Rage burned through Mason's blood, a familiar helplessness threatening to overwhelm him. History repeating itself. Blackwood giving orders that would result in the deaths of innocents, using power without conscience, confident that his position would shield him from consequences. But this time was different. This time Mason wasn't alone. A new commotion arose from the direction of town, more riders approaching, moving fast. Blackwood turned, irritation crossing his features at this second interruption. "Now what?" he muttered. The riders entered the camp at a gallop, Sheriff Redmond in the lead, followed by several deputies, and most surprisingly, a man in the formal attire of a federal judge. Behind them came more horsemen, these wearing the distinctive uniforms of U.S. Marshals. Blackwood's expression shifted from irritation to alarm. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded as Redmond dismounted and approached, one hand resting meaningfully on his holstered revolver. "Harrison Blackwood," Redmond said formally, "you are under arrest for the murder of Federal Marshal James Harding, for conspiracy to commit fraud, for violations of federal treaty provisions, and for numerous other crimes detailed in this warrant." He produced an official document, holding it up for all to see. Blackwood's face flushed with fury. "This is absurd. I am a respected businessman, a former colonel in the United States Army. You have no authority." "He doesn't, but I do," interrupted the man in formal attire, dismounting with the dignity of his office. "Judge William Harrington, Federal District Court. The evidence against you, Colonel Blackwood, is most compelling. Marshal Harding's journal makes for fascinating reading." Mason felt a surge of hope and vindication. Mrs. Thornton had delivered the evidence after all, and Redmond had acted on it immediately, bringing not just local law enforcement, but federal authorities with the power to arrest even someone of Blackwood's standing. But Blackwood wasn't finished. With the calculated calm of a man accustomed to commanding in crisis, he raised his voice to address the soldiers around him. "Captain Ellis, this is clearly a politically motivated attack on a decorated officer. I expect you to do your duty and remove these people from a military encampment immediately." Ellis hesitated, looking from Blackwood to the judge, clearly uncertain where authority truly lay in this unprecedented situation. Judge Harrington settled the matter by producing another document. "I have here direct orders from the Department of War instructing all military personnel to cooperate fully with this investigation and to place themselves under civilian authority for its duration." He fixed Ellis with a stern gaze. "Unless you wish to face charges of obstructing justice and violating direct orders, Captain, I suggest you stand down your men." The moment hung in perfect balance. Blackwood's authority against federal law, military discipline against civilian justice. Mason watched as Ellis struggled with his decision, the man's career, and possibly his freedom, hanging on his next words. "Lower your weapons," Ellis ordered finally, his voice tight but clear. "Stand down." The soldiers obeyed, rifles lowering, tension visibly draining from their postures. Many seemed almost relieved, as if freed from an obligation they had found increasingly uncomfortable. Blackwood's control shattered. "You fools, you gutless, worthless." He reached suddenly inside his coat, drawing a small Derringer pistol that had escaped detection. Several things happened at once. Redmond shouted a warning, reaching for his own weapon. Soldiers who had just lowered their rifles began raising them again in confusion. And Mason, operating on pure instinct, launched himself at Blackwood, closing the distance between them in 3 rapid strides. The Derringer discharged with a sharp crack, the bullet grazing Mason's shoulder as he collided with Blackwood, bearing the older man to the ground. They struggled briefly, Blackwood fighting with the desperate strength of a man who knew his world was collapsing. But Mason was younger, stronger, and fueled by 6 years of suppressed rage and guilt. When Redmond and his deputies pulled them apart, Blackwood was subdued, his fine clothes now dusty and torn, blood trickling from his split lip. The Derringer lay harmless in the dirt, its single shot expended. "Add attempted murder to the charges," Judge Harrington said, coldly observing the scene, "and release those prisoners immediately. They are material witnesses, not criminals." As deputies led Blackwood away in handcuffs, his final words were directed at Mason. "This isn't over, Hayes. Men like me don't stay down. Remember that." Mason barely heard him. His attention was fixed on the prisoner wagons, where soldiers were now removing restraints from the Apache captives. Hojo was among the first freed, the old man moving with slow dignity despite his ordeal. And then, emerging from the darkness beyond the camp's perimeter, came Neol. She walked openly, now her rifle slung across her back, her face showing the complex emotions of the moment. Relief, vindication, lingering anger at what her people had endured. She went first to her grandfather, embracing him with careful tenderness, checking him for injuries, speaking rapid Apache that Mason couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear in the gestures and expressions that accompanied it. Redmond approached Mason, eyeing his bloodied shoulder. "You need that looked at," he observed. "But first, I owe you thanks. Without Marshal Harding's journal, we'd never have had enough to move against Blackwood." "Mrs. Thornton delivered it." Redmond nodded. "Came straight to me last night, explained everything. I contacted Judge Harrington immediately. He was already in the territory on other business, fortunately. We moved as quickly as we could once we understood what was happening." "You believed her?" Mason said, a statement rather than a question. "I believe the evidence," Redmond corrected. "And I've had my suspicions about Blackwood for some time. The Marshal's journal just confirmed what many had guessed but couldn't prove. He glanced toward Neil and the other Apache. Though I admit I didn't expect this alliance between you and them. That was unexpected. Before Mason could respond, Nichol approached Hojo at her side. The old medicine man looked tired but unbowed by his captivity, his eyes still sharp and assessing as they moved from Mason to the sheriff. My grandfather wishes to thank you, Nichol said to Redmond, for bringing justice when we had almost lost hope of it. Redmond shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to such direct address from an Apache woman. Just doing my duty, ma'am. The law applies to everyone, even men like Blackwood. Hojo spoke then, his voice strong despite his age and recent ordeal. Neil translated, her own emotion evident beneath the formal words. He says that when the shadow lifts from the land, all creatures benefit from the returning light. The eagle and the mouse, the wolf and the deer, the white man and the Apache. Perhaps today marks such a lifting of shadows. Judge Harrington joined them, his formal demeanor softening slightly as he addressed Hojo through Neil. Your people have been wronged, sir. The evidence we've uncovered suggests systematic fraud in the management of reservation boundaries, illegal seizure of protected lands, and worse. It will take time, but I give you my word that these wrongs will be addressed through proper legal channels. Hojo listened to the translation, then responded with simple dignity. Words are like seeds, Neil translated. Their value lies not in their speaking, but in what grows from them. We will watch to see what your words grow into, Judge. As the conversation continued, tentative first steps toward reconciliation and justice, Mason found himself suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. The past day's events, the wound in his shoulder, the emotional toll of confronting Blackwood after so many years, all combined to drain his remaining strength. Neil noticed immediately, breaking away from the others to come to his side. You're injured, she said, examining his shoulder with gentle fingers, and exhausted beyond safety. Come, there is a stream nearby where we can tend your wound properly. She led him away from the busy camp, supporting him when his steps faltered, guiding him toward the sound of running water in the darkness. Mason recognized it as they approached. Sacred Water Creek, the boundary that had once separated their worlds, the place where their paths had first crossed. They settled beside the water, Neil helping Mason remove his shirt to better access the bullet graze on his shoulder. It was painful but not serious. The Derringer's small caliber and poor aim had prevented a more devastating injury. Neil cleaned the wound with water from the creek, then applied herbs from a small pouch she carried. Her touch was gentle, yet confident, the movements of someone well-versed in treating injuries. Thank you, Mason said quietly as she worked. For everything. For trusting me when you had every reason not to. For helping me find the courage to face the past. She glanced up, her eyes reflecting starlight. Perhaps we helped each other find such courage. When the wound was cleaned and bound, they remained by the creek listening to its gentle murmur, each processing the events that had led them to this moment. Around them the night was alive with sounds, insects chirring, an owl calling from nearby trees, the distant activity of the camp gradually settling as order was restored. What happens now? Mason asked finally. For your people, for... But he hesitated, then finished simply, for us. Neil considered for a long moment before answering. For my people, there is hope. Fragile but real. The judge seems honorable. The evidence compelling. Perhaps some of what was taken can be restored. She looked down at her hands and back to his face. As for us, she reached up to touch the medallion at her throat, then carefully removed it from around her neck. Taking Mason's hand, she placed a silver disc in his palm, closing his fingers around it. This belonged to you once, she said softly, given freely to save a child's life. Now I return it not as repayment of a debt, for such things cannot be measured in silver, but as a symbol. Of what? Mason asked, the medallion warm in his hand. Of cycles completed, of wounds beginning to heal. Neil's eyes held his, unwavering in their directness. When you first saw me in the creek, I spoke of marriage as a necessity, a protection against scandal and punishment. That was not truth, but strategy. Mason nodded, remembering that first encounter, how it had seemed both threat and opportunity. And now, Niall said, her voice gaining strength. If there is to be talk of joining lives, it would be from choice, not necessity, from recognition, not obligation. The implication hung in the air between them, as tangible as the medallion in Mason's hand. He studied it for a moment. The sunburst pattern worn smooth by years of handling, its journey from his possession to the child's to Neil, and now back to him, a circle completed. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and placed the medallion back in Neil's hand. Then let it be a different kind of symbol, he said. Not of cycles ended, but of new ones beginning. Not mine or yours, but ours. Neil's breath caught her fingers closing around the medallion. You are sure the path would not be easy. There would be those on both sides who would never accept such a union. I've spent 6 years in isolation trying to outrun memories and guilt, Mason replied. I don't want to spend the rest of my life alone, and I can't imagine finding anyone who understands me, the good and the bad, as well as you do. A smile bloomed on Neil's face, transforming her serious features, revealing a beauty that transcended cultural differences and historical divisions. My grandfather predicted this, you know. When you first came to our village, he said the bear charm he gave you was for a man who walks between worlds, and that such men often find their home in the borderlands with others of their kind. Mason touched the small, carved bear that still hung around his neck. Wise man, your grandfather. Yes, Neil agreed, and he will expect a proper ceremony with traditions from both our peoples honored. Her smile turned mischievous. He has already been planning it, I think, even before we acknowledged what was growing between us. Mason laughed, the sound surprising him with its freedom and joy, emotions he had almost forgotten in his years of self-imposed exile. Then we shouldn't disappoint him. He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining as they had on the hillside above her village, only days ago, yet somehow a lifetime. The creek murmured beside them, the water catching starlight and transforming it into liquid silver, a boundary no longer dividing but connecting, a meeting place rather than a line of separation. In that moment, surrounded by the ancient landscape that had witnessed countless human dramas, yet remained essentially unchanged, Mason felt a sense of rightness, of coming home after a long journey. Not to a place, but to a person. Not to answers, but to possibilities. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would be many, he had no illusions about that, they would face them together, drawing strength from their differences as much as their similarities, creating something new at the intersection of their separate worlds. Neo, he said softly, her name like a prayer on his lips. Wind, always changing, always free, yet touching everything in its path. Mason, she replied in kind. Builder, creator of shelter and home of boundaries and bridges. Their words hung in the night air, simple yet profound acknowledgments of identities that remained distinct even as they moved toward union. And as Sacred Water Creek continued its eternal journey between lands claimed by different peoples, Mason Hayes and Ayo found in each other the rare gift of belonging, not despite their differences, but because of them. A vow by the creek, unspoken, yet binding. A new story beginning where an old one had finally found its resolution. And above them, the vast desert sky stars, witnessing silently as they had for countless generations before and would for countless more to come.